and welcome back to Every Trivial Fact. This is your host. My name is Noah, and today's guest again is Gregory Gravelle, writer, thinker, philosopher, and host of the Into the Absurd podcast. Thanks for being here, Greg.
Thanks for having me, Mina. I'm excited to discover the self a little bit more with you today.
Yeah. This is our follow-up episode. I don't think I've said this yet, right? This is a follow-up episode on the first part, Jung's Undiscovered, or Carl Gustav Jung, his book, The Undiscovered Self. And if you could sum that up, what would you say it's about, Greg?
The Undiscovered Self?
Yeah.
Well, for the most part, it's about, he starts off with stating the problem. And the problem in modern society, especially post-World War II, is that there's all these things going on, like all these government agencies, all these political groups, this whole huge machine called civilization and society, which kind of rules over us and gets us into these mindsets where we're easily controlled and manipulated by, say, I guess for the most part, the will of the public, of public interest groups, the herd. And especially today, I would say really all those people who are most vocal on social media, and those people who are most vocal on social media who have a certain moral agenda. And Jung says that for the most part, we are victim to these bigger controls in society because we do not know ourselves. We haven't spent enough time discovering who we are. And because we don't know who we are essentially defenseless to these bigger groups, because if we don't know who we are, we let other people tell us who we are. And because we let other people tell us who we are, we also let them tell us what to do, because being something implies that you're something which does something, right? And then so if we're told who we are, then we'll do the things that are necessary in being that person who we told who we are.
Right. Yeah, there's a whole implicit set of, of duties, assumptions, roles, attitudes, feelings, thoughts.
Yes. And that basically sums it up. I mean, for the most part, especially of what we've talked about.
Right. It's almost, and the way I almost see it, and we can get into this pretty quickly, but for any animal to be any kind of equilibrium or homeostasis, with its environment, however, because these things are so easily to disrupt, in nature, in animals, right? All it takes is the introduction of one foreign object or insect or you name it, and it can have vast consequences on an ecosystem and on other animals, right? So for us, the larger social climate, because, our world isn't just the physical world, it's also our inner world, our inner experiences, the thoughts and the feelings that we share with others, whether it's love or hatred, laughter or fear, it makes up part of our inner and outer world. And then, like I said, for equilibrium, it's like there's basically within any environment, there is, what do you call it, equalizing pressures, right? And in that, you get some sort of livable period or stasis for your animals. It's never permanent in the course of history. But basically what Jung is describing here, biologically speaking, is kind of like, you could say in a sense, it's a breakdown of that, the breakdown of the nation state as it ironically tries to, preserve itself, like, as you said, in the name of public interest, basically. And then Jung starts the entire essay, just as a quick recap of kind of what we talked about. He says, quote, "Everywhere in the West, there are subversive minorities who, sheltered by our humanitarianism and our sense of justice, hold the incendiary torches ready with nothing to stop the spread of their ideas except the critical reason of a single, fairly intelligent, mentally stable stratum of the population. One should not, however, overestimate the thickness of this stratum. It varies from country to country in accordance with national temperament. Also, it is regionally dependent on public education and is subject to the influence of acutely disturbing factors of a political and economic nature." like maybe we should stop there for a second and unpack that real quick, is just to say that he's saying, it doesn't, so far he's kind of framing the picture and the problem, and he's saying, even if you have an entire civilization that is largely somewhat rational and functional and productive and can handle its business, that it doesn't take much of the population to destabilize those fundamental workings. And in the advent of modern idealism and ideology and revolutionary thought and, this never-ending kind of cycle, this is what he's saying, is that, whether it's anarchists, leftists, rightists, like there exists, every time there's an ideological, you tell me, right? Like every time there's an ideological motivated uh, disaster or bombing or, act of violence, right? What
Well, you get
exactly is
trapped
happening
on
there?
that ideal, though. You get trapped on that ideal,
Yeah,
and you start to think, we need to go for this ideal, and we can't edit it. Sorry, and anything that goes against
right.
it, you're evil. Right? This
One-sided
ideal is good.
idealism.
You're
It
evil.
takes over, and it takes over the psyche, and it rounds down, dumbs down, reduces down all those complex factors that go into an individual. So we'll keep going here. Taking plebiscites as a criterion, that's I think that's kind of like, you could say that's like the general consensus of a voting body, maybe.
Did you say
Uh,
plebiscite?
Plebiscites, yeah, that's how I'm pronouncing
Could
that.
you tell me what that means? Sorry.
It's okay. So my thought, it's like the vote of an electorate on a bit, like something that's like some big change. I don't know if it has to be constitutional or if it has to be, you know what I mean? But it's it's an actual movement or change, you could say, like something big
Okay.
in the voting majority electorate.
Okay. Yeah. The
Taking
direct
plebiscites
vote.
as a criterion, and it should make sense in context here better. One could, on an optimistic estimate, put its upper limit at about 40% of the electorate. A rather more pessimistic view would not be unjustified either, since the gift of reason and critical reflection is not one of man's outstanding peculiarities, and even where it exists, it proves to be wavering and inconstant. The more so, as a rule, the bigger the political groups are. The mass, and this is crucial here, right? The mass crushes out the insight and reflection that are still possible with the individual, and this necessarily leads to doctrinaire and authoritarian tyranny if ever the constitutional state should succumb to a fit of weakness. Power move by a Caesar or some other chancellor or the military
Hmm.
when a civilization does make a large move, right?
Have you ever seen the movie Avatar with
Yeah,
the
you
blue
talking
aliens?
James Cameron, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the way that I think about it sometimes is that sometimes we want to be safe in society and we want to protect ourselves, but we have this inner self, right? Our shadow, that's kind of sitting there, and we repress that. And I think in a sense, what we do is that we kind of plug into this avatar realm, and then our mask is the blue alien that's walking around like being all good and nice and
Blending in
not
with the
really.
rest of the blue aliens.
Yep, and blending in with the rest of the blue aliens. But on the inside, we're this guy who's just sitting there,
You telling
with
me
all
that
this
people
shit plugged
people are
into us.
people are not as they appear? That they're not just the simple being you see before them. That there's stuff going on in
Not
there.
everyone,
Yeah, no,
but
it's
I
a
think most people.
yeah. Oh well, I mean that's the whole thing. I mean that's to people who want to oversimplify the human condition and what makes up an individual. Psychoanalysis and psychology and the study of history will tell you otherwise, because there's always a lot going on inside these little noodles of ours. And they're
Yes.
more than meets the eye for sure. And this is what Young, points out here. The mass crushes out the insight and reflection. I had mentioned, we kind of got into this talk last time. The longer you go along to get along, the longer you go against the grain, it's almost like the less likely any kind of will in you has been eroded over time. This is how the mob crushes it out, right? Like if you're not
Yes.
allowed a voice, and if you as an individual disappear into the crowd, uh, then who's really in charge, and then who's really in power. It's a serious question and problem. And then so after kind of framing these problems, Jung also lays down the classical liberal and Western foundation of the premise of the individual, both the scientific understanding of around it and through it, and also what's needed to insulate um, the mind, you could say, from these modern horrors, not to just insulate rather, but to
Protect
inoculate,
it.
yeah, to protect, to inoculate against it. And we talked about this before. It could be family, it could be God. This is getting into the necessity of the religious impulse, and because Nietzsche frames it as the loss of the ability to think psychologically and religiously. And then Jung also kind of echoes that sentiment, which we also discussed last time. It's toward the end of the podcast, if I recall. But it's like both of that takes for granted, like how many people even have that potential. When Voltaire says that some people are, the way they view the world is so simple that all they can think of is in terms of basic facts, like they actually can't do much
Yes.
abstraction or, complex equations, you could say, or dancing, right? Like thinking is dancing, let's say, that,
They can't read behind the
yeah,
lines or
yes,
between
not
the
all,
lines
right. Yeah. Yeah. And when we're
or
not,
behind it.
yeah, and not everyone's the same. Not everyone has the same interest, and the fact that we can kind of run on autopilot speaks deeply to the nature of our psychology. That uh, part of this larger understanding is going, okay, that when it comes to, let's say, societies, the dejected, the outgroups, those subversives who are resentful and who do want to change it or tear it down or burn it down or whatever the case may be. These are just the dangers of what these evolutionary pressures produce. Like taking Nietzsche's kind of angle, we could see that the state itself produces its own enemies. Whether it's anarchists, communists within, fascists within, you name it. Or without. That it's inevitable in the course of its workings that that's been humanity in warfare, right? And we see history shows us that people also hold grudges. It can be an individual or an entire nation, but when that will is accumulated and let loose, like, you see disaster easily happens, and then you quick question, like, to the degrees that we are trying to be good blue aliens, people like to imagine that they would go against such forces, but inevitably, back to the bystander effect and also passing the buck and the banality of evils, that people just kind of go along with it. It's easy to imagine that, people, you're going to act a hero, but when push comes to shove, it's like, nah, chances are you
Yeah.
just go along to get along too.
I think I actually have my analogy backwards. It's he's a good human, but when he's with the blue aliens, when he's in his avatar like body or whatever, he kind of starts to rebel against the military, right? The government that he works for. But when he's
Oh,
back as a human state, he kind of goes along to get along. So maybe actually the avatar is almost more so his real person, that he goes in and kind of zones out and gets away and kind of becomes more himself.
yeah, or it could be external, again, internal and external pressures.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of unrelated, but I thought I'd mention that just because I didn't
Yeah,
want
no,
people
no,
to
yeah,
misunderstand the
okay, yeah, fair,
movie.
because you're right. He does, because he does make he makes his about face in that. Maybe in
Yes.
that case it is supposed to be his real self.
Yeah, and well, I mean, the thing with that is that we kind of sometimes we walk about our lives, at least I do, and I don't necessarily show my authentic self, but I do when I'm writing or when I'm podcasting or when I'm doing things that I love and care about. And in a sense, that's when I'm kind of projecting
Well,
my inner world
right, but I
onto
think
my
that's
outer world.
culture and society, because it's like culture and society kind of, it's the nature of commerce and business. It's kind of like, look, man, we don't have time for everyone's individual self. That's why you get in line, right? And that's why
Yes.
generally speaking, most people are subject to these rules. Very few people are outside of them by, luck of birth or whatever it is, for fortune
Yes.
or effort, you name it.
But again, that's a part of it, right? Because of our society and because of the business nature of it, many of us feel almost trapped when we're going about
Oh,
our
right,
normal
right.
lives.
The kind of the crux of the matter, that again, the mass of the outside does crush out the individual. It's
Yes.
inevitable that even you can be authentic. Like, it's like there's a time and a place for everything. And it's like, look, there's plenty of aspects to modern life that lots of people don't like, but you're going to be hard pressed to change it or fix it. Because
Yes.
it's so complex and it's so wide and it's beyond any individual's power. And this got into other thoughts along the lines, of Jung questioning, like, How can we, it's crazy to think that we ever thought the individual mattered when there's so many people, one life compared to 10,000, 10,000,000, 10 billion, right? It's insane that we ever came to even believe that the individual mattered.
Yes.
So let's see, we covered, the destabilization of society, the force of the zeitgeist, the mass, the importance of the mass versus the individual and the individual versus the mass, you could say, and then the internal equalizing pressures of, complex religious thought, belief, psychological understanding, these kind of internal bulwarks against the larger mass manipulation. But even then, there's something I don't want to miss here, and that's that it's not so easy to resist the mass when we are social creatures. And if we don't
Yes.
have a better defense against and if we don't understand where the attacks are coming from or how they're being leveraged, then it's easy to get caught up in that.
Yes, and part of these attacks are within the inner framework of the system itself.
Right, right. And that again, that it doesn't take much to destabilize that. So even if all, or even think of like something like a civil war. In a lot of civil wars, it's like you have a whole nation, but only like a few percentage of the people are actually engaged in the fighting, yet it destabilizes the whole nation. That shows you how much conflict has a cost, or
Yes.
its cost, its effects, all that stuff.
Well, it can change everything, or at least mostly everything.
Yes.
I'd say it depends on how much destruction there is to see how much radical change there is, in a sense.
Right.
But are you good with continuing on to part 5, or is there anything else that we should summarize?
Yeah, we can go ahead and get going.
Okay, cool. Then how about we just restart part
Okay.
5, just because we weren't that far.
Sure, go ahead and take us off.
So, quote, man is an enigma to himself, unquote. And then I said in my notes, I said, although we can compare humanity to animals with our anatomy, we are unable to do so with our psyche. The individual likewise finds it difficult to understand themselves by comparing themselves to others because he is unique and wholly different from others. That is, others do not resemble himself and thus cannot fully provide what he needs for self-understanding. And I also pulled up a quote on my computer. It's kind of a pop culture reference, and I'm sure they got it from Jung, but it's from SpongeBob. It's an episode when Patrick, he says, the inner machinations of my mind are an enigma. And that's an interesting thing to show up in a children's TV show. um,
Right.
but in the early 2000s, the kids TV shows like SpongeBob, Fairly Odd Parents, Jimmy Neutron, all those shows were very they reflected a lot of dark themes in society that us kids were exposed to, or not dark, but more advanced themes that we were exposed to.
Right.
And I think that that was that episode in particular was really important, I think, to a lot of people, because like so many of my friends remember that episode and that quote. um, I just thought I'd
Oh
bring
yeah,
that
did
up for a
did did
second,
did it did it
but
get your little noodles thinking in that direction of what could that mean? What exactly is going on inside there?
I think at the time it was just funny and I laughed. But I think over time those things do sink in, because there's this thing in psychology where there's sort of an incubation period of
Oh
ideas.
yeah, I'd say it's yeah, and it's almost like it's an unconscious wading into the depths. And then it's almost like it takes a long roundabout journey to recognize actually what's changed. And it's like, well, in theory, you know, n- well, in theory, nothing's changed outside of you, but yet your consciousness has changed, or your
Yes.
personality has changed depending on what's happened to you.
Yeah. And then, so I think Jung kind of brings up, he kind of like brings up the example of, say, if there was some alien, this is like a complete summary, but he says something along the lines of, sure, we might be able to understand ourselves better if there's some alien civilization that
Oh,
was similar to us and could think and talk like we did. But since
right.
all we have is humans to compare ourselves with, we're very much mysteries to ourselves. And since everyone is very unique, that makes it even harder still to
Right.
understand ourselves.
Individual consciousness. It's an exception to the statistical rule in which we try to understand and parcel out the world anyway, right? Like
Yes.
that we can try to account for an individual and lump them into some vague abstract category and organize policy around the notion of public welfare and all these things. But again, this is where the individual gets rounded down and lost. The state, church, science, entertainment, it all brings the individual's attention to the outside world rather than the inner world. A lot of these external distracting forces prevent us from self-discovery. Oh, and then I guess this is the last, this comes to mind, and it's the last thing I did want to recap from our last talk, was when Jung writes, resistance to the organized mass can be affected only by the man who is as well organized in his individuality as the mass itself, end quote. I think I forgot the first qualifier there,
Yes.
but and then look, we can approach this in many ways, and we can live in solitude, and we can, and I've seen people say like, oh, questions and matters of society, civilization, it doesn't matter, and they could, there's other escapist approaches, but I think this misses a larger important point, because Jung would later states, quote, thus it is the doctor is summoned willy-nilly to appear on the world stage, and questions are addressed to the doctor which primarily concern the most intimate and hidden life of the individual, but which in the last analysis are the direct results of the zeitgeist, end quote. That's to say that the individual is intertwined with the outer world and these mass forces. The individual doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? He only exists within context and pressures and position of his place and time, including his, you could say, what is it, the arbitrary relationship of nature and people and things, like however things tumbled out and wherever he landed in this world, whatever his experience is, he was affected deeply by all this because life is a personal experience. We are people. We feel
Yes.
things personally. We experience the world personally. And it's ironic that we speak objectively, and we do that. To speak objectively, it's shorthand and it's business, but it's not the end all be all. And this is, this reminds me of all the bean counter and scientific types who get real like, well, actually, this is not, you didn't carry the two, right? When it comes to matters of the individual, and it's like, again, to try and put him in an Excel spreadsheet, it's like, okay, you missed the point. We've boiled life down to such an art that maybe we can just automate the whole thing, and then we don't have to live at all. We can just be brains and vats or something, like it kind of, you start heading in that direction with your thinking, again, I guess, and it goes for any one-sided idealism, right? You see it with religious people, you see it with scientific thinkers, you see it with nihilists. It's like when one aspect or dimension of being or life takes over the whole consciousness, it's like, that's potential trouble. Or no, I'm not going to say potential. I think it is always
It is
trouble.
trouble.
It's always trouble, yeah, because we have to be able to, it's almost like the mind does have to be able to better adapt. It has to be able to think more on its feet and not fall into very, what would you call it, established ruts of thinking. Not, because it's like, if I think there's a purpose to thinking, it's to expand your mind and thus your world, thus your options, thus your abilities, right? It actually serves a very practical purpose. This gets into the other notion, the important notes from last time where you said, where Jung says philosophy has become a strictly intellectual affair, not a way of life. And,
Yes.
like I said, that almost betrays an idealism. You could take it in an idealistic sense, like, oh, we've lost this ability to think this way. And it's like, again, arguably, most people aren't that creative in the first place, or, that well trained, let's say, because it actually, education actually requires a lot of energy and input. That's a serious factor in this.
Yeah, and we aren't really, I mean, we're told what to think, not how to think for the most part. Sure, school does
Yeah, it's
help
kind
us.
of, it's a half-ass kind of when
Yeah,
they like, I mean, I've been hearing people on and off in America for years talk about, oh yeah, the point of a liberal, and I mean, I mean even more classical liberal, like what do you call it? Not even humanist or cosmopolitan, but just what do you call it? Yeah, I guess so. Kind of classical, liberal. It's kind of
Democrat.
like, no, not necessarily political. I mean,
Okay,
I do
okay,
mean more like more European tradition here. I mean,
okay.
in that classical Enlightenment value of like, what do you call it?
Like
Oh no, they.
Renaissance
I
sort of a
guess they know
deal.
they, but they do repeat it, and it usually is kind of the more political people, and it's like, oh yeah, the point of a humanitarian education was to teach you how to think. And the notion is that you were going to learn how to critically think and thus be prepared to deal with the world. And then whenever
Yes.
that goes off the rails, it's like, no, that's where you're telling people, that's the sausage factory, and we've questioned this before. I think we've said this,
Well,
what I did forget to mention though, by the way, Greg, was that our talk on Emerson's, our first few podcasts and our talks on self-reliance from the last year covered a lot of this stuff in a roundabout manner and in direct
yeah.
manners, because self-reliance has everything to do with the aversion to the way the masses do crush us out and the leveling, rounding down effects of modern life.
Well, I think at the end of the day, with when we're talking about education, is that the system itself doesn't really have that big of an impact on whether or not you're taught how to think or what to think. It's really the teachers, because I've had teachers who are within the system who really taught me how to think, just with the way that they teach. Um,
Yeah, oh, those I'd say those were the best then, obviously. Where
yes,
it wasn't even that it wasn't that they were lecturing to you that
yeah,
impacted you. It wasn't that they supposedly held a position and authority, and that it was that they demonstrated something commendable or
yeah,
respectable. And then you
yes,
go, shit, what's that? What does he have there? How did he get that? Where did that come from? How do you
yes.
do that? That's what a good teacher really does, right? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
I
I
mean, we
think,
still have homework and all the projects and stuff, but it's all the stuff in between all that and how he gets us to do these projects and the
yeah,
assignments.
I had a few like that, and then even a few male teachers, a few women teachers,
Yes.
yeah, over the whole course of my education that definitely had profound impacts at that point in my life.
Yeah.
um, on my, some like killed my desires for
Yeah.
education, and some encouraged them, and so and I think that's kind of hit and miss, and that's in an individual's life that's actually crucial, and it doesn't even have to be inside a
Yes.
government education system, right? It can be
Yes.
anywhere else where a teacher is found, or a
Yeah.
mentor is found, where connection with
Yes.
another individual is found, really. That's what we're
Yeah. And
talking
I
about, the
bring that
personal
up.
relationship.
I bring that up because it's more about the individual. I mean, it's if you focus on changing how the individual teacher is or selecting the individual teachers, um, and and teachers focus on their individual relationship with the students, then things can really change.
Oh yeah, and this also, I think, yeah, and even this kind of actually reflects even Jung talking about the relationship between a good doctor and his patient, and because
Exactly.
I qualify it with a good doctor to mean, again, because he's actually, very few, most a lot of psychologists, scientists, right, even philosophers, right, we get geared to think in terms of what do you call it, systems and systematizing, and it's easy to miss things that you wouldn't consider in a million years if it wasn't for, but oh, look at this last little trivial fact over here, because in not just doing away with so much to focus on so little, because no matter how we systematize, it's like, oh man, we miss so much data, like there's so much data, it's impossible to account for it all. And I
Yes.
also think we discussed that in education, that there are gaps in our understanding and our knowledge, and it takes a long time to fill it out. And then again, it moves, so far it's been moving on the geologic time scale, because the civilization thing has been rising and falling and coming and going for thousands and thousands of years now, tens of thousands of years now, right, actually. But its modern incarnation is thus. So let's keep and I guess to cap kind of this kind of our thoughts in this direction off. I did have one more thing that came to mind here, actually.
Go for it.
That whole notion of the individual to resist the outside, it's almost like, it's like, okay, just like, so if the natural habitat is your body and your mind, and that's your individual physiology, how you react to this world, and then the pressure upon which others, think about it, it could be a predator like a lion, or it could be just a group of human beings yelling at you or telling you what to do. That exerts a pressure and a force upon you, and
Yes.
no different than you could call that, let's just be frank, it's a hostile environment, right? In every
Yeah.
hostile environment, we can live there, but it takes special accounting and usually special equipment. So, in the cold gear, right? In underwater, you need a diving suit. And so I would say, in terms of these modern mass forces, the mass man, who is pent up and put upon by, mass media, mass opinion, mass government, you name it, right? That it's creating your own pressurized atmosphere within to deal with the, the crushing fathoms without. It's to be supported internally. And again, we've talked about this in a few ways and a few times over maybe it's repetitive and redundant at this point, but I'm just, it's just, what do you call it, mapping the space or trying to make clear what phenomenon we are speaking. Because look, psychologically speaking, how do you categorize that? How do you put that in a pamphlet for the APA? I don't know.
Well, it's fight or flight. It's fight, flight, or freeze,
Yeah,
really.
okay, yeah. And then there's a certain aspect of competence in there where it's like, hey, with with the right combination, your physiology can pause and assess the threat and then act in accord rather
Yes.
than just reacting. But that could be also, and that's why it's so dangerous, right? Because that could be the difference between life and death. That pause might be your death, but it also might be in which you realize, hey, I can take this threat on and I know how to do it.
So I don't know if I describe or if I mentioned this movie at all before, but
Mhm.
it's called Mr. Nobody.
Yes. I don't
Um,
know if we have.
yeah, but I'll just give it a brief explanation anyways. It's a movie about, it's kind of a spoiler, but it's a movie about this kid who his parents are splitting up and he doesn't know which one to live with. So he decides just not to make any choice at all and he just runs away from either of them. And of course, we don't know that that's what the movie is about until the very end of the movie. So unfortunately, that's a huge
Oh,
spoiler
well,
alert.
yeah,
But
well, no, it's the opposite of a spoiler. For it to be a spoiler alert, you have to say it first. Well, yeah, we'll leave it. It's fine.
well, I guess a spoiler. That's a spoiler apology for
Epilogue?
you. Yep,
Spoiler
it's a
epilogue.
spoiler epilogue for all of you. But anyways, so when we're split between two decisions, fight or flight, essentially, a lot of people, including myself, we just freeze because we don't know if we want to fight, we don't know if we want to flight, we don't know if we want mom or dad, so we just freeze and we go somewhere in the middle because sometimes when you
Oh,
have
right.
to make a
Or are you
decision,
talking about arrested? Are you talking about like more something like arrested development, or what Zaf would call an
yes,
anchoring spasm, where it's like, hey, you actually there needs to be some important decision or motion needs to happen here, and you're just kind of you're kind of sweeping the dust under the rug, kind of thing.
yeah, like you need to make a decision and you
Excuse me.
can't make the decision, so you just sit there and you wait until
Oh,
something,
until it hurts enough to move to do something
yeah,
about it.
or if just something happens, right? You just wait for something to happen, basically,
Oh yeah.
or for it to hurt until
Talk
you
about an
happen,
existential
right?
problem, right? It's like, well, chances are you'll be waiting on a ship that never comes, you know?
Yes,
So,
exactly.
to keep moving here, we're talking, let's see. So I think we got into this last time, but we'll cover it again real quick. Academic psychology is scared of the risk of examining the individual and prefers to avoid complex situation by asking ever simpler questions. It has full freedom of the choice of questions it will put to nature, right? And this is bias in all nature, people and things, right? It's fine. It's part of the deal. It's not a particular big deal. It's just a matter of sussing out, well, what are the limitations of whatever methodology and approach you're using, assuming it's not, fundamentally flawed or bubkiss to begin with, in terms of any kind of scientific or rational or psychological approach. So the clinical psychologist must likewise ensure that they leave the patient up to his environment and not interfere or suggest anything that would interfere with the understanding their authentic self problems. Right? The psychologist has to be careful that he himself is not projecting into his victim or his patient. I mean, I'd say you're a victim if you got a bad psychologist, but no, because then it's a potent manipulator at work there. If you think about it, right? If he actually, right?
Yes.
If he's
Well, I've had a bad therapist before. She like I would explain something, and then she'd say something like that was really suggestive. She'd say something like, "So, do you think you're a little obsessive, a little bit compulsive?"
No, I choose to
And
think of myself as compulsively happy. I don't know.
well, then I'm thinking like, dude, you're not supposed to do that. Like I've been reading, like I'm getting a degree in psychology, and that's one of the number one things not to do is to be suggestive like that. Um, but yeah, I mean, in that
Yeah,
case,
no,
I felt
it's
like a
better. It's better.
victim,
No, it's
right?
better. No, it's you're asking questions to draw out what's already there. Like
Yeah.
you actually, in theory, you're not supposed to add anything from the outside actually at all.
Yes.
You're bringing to the forefront of their consciousness what has already transpired in the course of this person's life and experience and history,
Yes.
whether that's happy or traumatic or no matter what. Again, this person has been profoundly affected by life, right? It's like, let's not take that for granted that, oh, and I think we did, we got into that a little bit last time, actually, saying that it's easy to think because we've survived so well for so long, it's easy to think that we are pretty badass, and to degrees we are, right? But it's like,
Yes.
don't mistake, like, look, okay, I'll put it like this. You can watch videos of, or talk to old, World War II vets, and, a lot of them, when they recall their experience, it's like, dude, they'll shamelessly cry about who they loved and lost and, those harrowing experiences, right? Um,
Yeah.
and that's that they were profoundly affected. And that's something that changed and affected their life for the rest of their life, and not a day goes by that they don't think about that harrowing experience. And I'd say that most affecting and traumatic things are like that to a degree, almost.
Yeah.
That we
Especially
have
their
a
experience with
history.
other people.
It's kind of why one-sided idealisms are so bad, why they're so dangerous, because a lot of times they kind of assume a year zero attitude, right? Like we're gonna somehow scrub our history and culture of all this trauma, and it's just like, no, it doesn't work that way, guys, and you're just gonna inflict new ones.
Yes.
With these kind of, again, revolutionary one-sided idealisms, and it could be again, whether it's religious, strictly political, and more agnostic, doesn't matter. But as Jung says, don't suggest anything to interfere on the outside, right? And the patient, in other words, should find comfort in being around something that is not an authoritative, like the propaganda, advertisements, etc. Yeah, in the sense that it's not profiting off your weakness, like advertising does, like in a lot of ways of, hey, you're not
Yes.
cool enough, hey, you're not sexy enough, hey, you're not right, or even in our media, the standards and ideals that are put forth, and
You
again,
sound obsessive.
uh,
But yeah, I mean, like you can't
I
just.
prefer creative. I prefer affected or touched. I prefer insane.
Yeah, well, I
Well,
mean, they
why is
can
but this
be.
is but well, I mean, maybe, but I think that's coming from the school of normal, right? And by,
Yeah.
if you know what I mean by that, right? This is where Jung says, quote, let it society band together into groups and organizations as much as it likes, it is just this banding together and the resultant extinction of the individual personality that makes it succumb so readily to a dictator. A million zeros joined together do not, unfortunately, add up to one. And maybe, yeah.
Yes.
And then we could probably, I think we covered a lot of this. Maybe we could just skip ahead to the philosophical and psychological approach to life.
The philosophical and psychological approach. Our ideas must be adapted to the outside world, and the outside world must be adapted to our ideas. For if one lags behind the other, we are in for a real disaster. Communism is far ahead or behind our biology, and it is trying to remake man in the form of the state. However, the state should be made in the image of man, not the other way around. And that's a paraphrase.
Right, right. And then this is, philosophy is no longer a way of life, but an intellectual exercise. Yeah. Or you delegate your consciousness therein to a larger mass and a pre-established ideal that you borrowed or stole from some dead
Yes.
man of some archaic aspect of Western culture from hundreds of years ago, left over in the advent of the dictator state and these diseases of ism, let's say. People just become fixated.
Yes.
So while religion is obsolete and conflicts with the scientific understanding when taken literally, it can be extremely useful in navigating. I think we covered a lot of this stuff last time, actually. Pretty well,
Yeah, I think
actually.
we covered probably
Yeah.
about half of this.
Yeah, yeah. Maybe it is okay. It is likewise. Let's see.
Likewise, the case that from the deification of the word, that credulity has become something of a lie to people, by which commands and the sacred "you should" becomes infuriating for people. And so the psychologist mustn't demand, but rather listen and understand.
Oh, right. Yeah, because it's old and tiresome at this point, right? The
Yeah.
endless thou shalts and shall nots. Okay, and then you have a good some crucial groundwork Jung is talking about here. Two components of instinct, dynamism and compulsion, right? Dynamism is that you could say animal spontaneity or adaptability, and compulsion is it maybe is the evolutionary drive that like we must repeat these behaviors to survive. And
Yes.
then so there's dynamism, compulsion on one side, and meaning intention on the other, and that's our
Yes.
psychological rationalization approach and assumptions, which may or may not be
Yes.
right, or may or may not be grounded in reality at all. For being for
Yes.
being sentient apes, who kind of came out of the primordial soup here. It's pretty impressive. Pretty crazy. We put out that over time we've put all these bits and pieces of disassociated data together to this massive and organizational scale.
So, I mean, sometimes you just can't explain
See,
something
that
to
to me is
someone.
to me that is madness. To me, that's fucking obsessive. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, and then you get some random psychologist asking you, "You think you're a bit obsessed with?" It's like, dude, did you see what we do? Like, you see what's required for survival, lady? Like, okay,
Yeah,
have you been comforted by suicide, lady? Like, probably not. You're probably normal and healthy. You crazy people who call yourselves normal and healthy. Anyway, go on.
I 100% agree with you. But I mean, what I was going to say is that sometimes it's just impossible to explain something to someone.
Sure.
It's impossible to explain, say, an inner deep feeling, because like I'll go and I'll try to explain to someone why I did something or why I thought something was a good idea, and then they'll kind of say like how they interpreted what I said to them, and then
Right.
I'll be thinking, no,
Right, but
that's
could it,
not
okay,
what I mean.
quick
That's
question.
not.
Could it also be your part for lacking the ability to better articulate? Because remember back to our
Yes.
discussion on education, like this is maybe you're at a different point and what you're trying to explain is just it's a map the territory is so far removed from this person's map of the world that maybe they wouldn't see that unless they had another 5 years of experience in this domain over here, or unless they were also saw or experienced something similar. You know what I mean? It could, again, there's a lot of complexity, I guess, that goes into human perception. I'm trying to not take that for granted here for the moment.
No, yeah, I mean that's what I mean. It's hard to
Oh,
articulate
and not just
how
that
we
though.
feel, not but like partially because we're unsure how we feel or why.
Arguably impossible. Because remember, even Nietzsche writes that, that thoughts are just the reflections of the shadows of our feelings, ever
Yes.
lighter, ever simpler, ever less profound. I'm butchering the writing here, but that's
Yeah.
if that's the de facto position. And then Nietzsche also says, again, butchering man's old school psychological axiomatic assumptions and all that. When he writes something like that we're never actually seen or understood, we're only praised or blamed. It's like, whoa, that's actually quite spooky because then you can assume you're being appreciated for who and what you are, but you see you're only being judged in context of these external people in this external world who have their own thoughts and feelings and views of the world and you in it. And so they don't actually understand your motive, right? They don't understand, they might assume they understand your dynamism and compulsion according to psychological theory, but it's like, do they get your meaning and intention? Well, maybe it depends on how educated and if consciousness is potentially an infinitely deep reflecting pool, you could say, well, it's contingent upon how deep these men have also dove, what they've seen and felt and experienced to understand the depth and complexity of your thoughts and feelings. Because there's different, maybe put it like this: there's, what started as your simple suggestion here has many depths and layers of complexity, right? Both
Yes.
the not just it's because not just a matter of your articulation, it's a matter of are they in a place to understand. And then arguably you could say you could get to a point where you would discern who will or won't understand what maybe you have to say, but you never know.
Hmm.
Because you don't, again, back to being a good psychologist, you don't want to just assume, because if you just assume, then how are you going to be surprised or proven wrong? Because it's inevitable. Like only crazy people think they're never wrong, right? Only crazy
Yes.
people think they're right about everything. There's the danger again of one-sided thinking. Because even in the course of this conversation, we could take the angle of like, oh, we've been right about everything.
Yes. And these
Which is
people
I
who
like,
think,
like, yeah, well, no, we're not mistaken at all.
well, when they think that they're right about everything, they think that everyone else is crazy or wrong or
Yeah,
stupid.
I guess it can get into you can get into kind of conspiratorial territory rather than actually kind of again more analytical or scientific territory. But
Yeah, I mean I mean that was kind of just a kind of a wide ranging um, stereotypical remark, but so like you can kind of like neuroticize other people,
Oh, sure.
like
Yes.
say like, oh, these people, like, why are they doing that? They're crazy. Like, why do all these millions of people believe in this? It's
It depends
stupid.
on your position and their position.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
And then and then moving forward with Jung's theory, right? All of man's functions have an instinctual foundation at the end of the day, though. Like
Yeah.
that dynamism, that compulsion, that meaning and tension, right? And that could be your religion and your moral prescriptions, and then your actual actions and the deeper evolutionary drive that's really, forcing your will underneath it. It's the complexity of these matters. I'll keep going here. Our learning capacity, or rather our ability to stem away from instinct, is, quote, the ultimate source of those numerous psychic disturbances and difficulties which are occasioned by man's progressive alienation from his instinctual foundation, i.e., by his uprootedness and identification with his conscious knowledge of himself, by his concern with his consciousness at the expense of the unconscious. The result is that modern man knows himself only insofar as he can become conscious of himself, a high a capacity largely dependent on environmental conditions, knowledge, and control of which necessitated or suggested certain modifications of his original instinctive tendencies. Okay, see, so we're already like knees deep in this thing here, and we're not even done with the quotation. But if we could simplify this, he's saying that, to associate your whole self with the limitations of your consciousness of yourself is to miss your own persona of which you've put forth to the world that has been modified by external conditioning and suggestions, you know,
Yes.
that, right, of which necessitated or suggested certain modification of his original instinctive tendencies. We're talking about behavior modification. We're talking about social fungineering and engineering, right? We're talking about changing your mind and your thoughts and your feelings, or maybe just teaching you to stand in line, right? It varies in, it's not all nefarious and, conspiratorial. Some of it's very simple, right? It's just necessary that, like, okay, it's no different than training a dog. Like, your dog has to be somewhat civilized and socialized. Otherwise, dude, it's going to hurt someone, and it's going to literally be put down by governmental regulation.
Yes.
And humans are no different. Like, you can play in our society thus far, but once you start behaving this way, and if you harm people in these, man, right, that's the government. The government has a monopoly on violence. You're affecting government property and procedure. You've committed
Yes.
a crime. It's literally just saying, like, look, you're fucking with business here, right? Can and then I know we've already covered all this. Animals being domesticated or domesticatable in the first place. Good people don't need no governance, and bad people can't be governed at all, right? In theory. So we'll keep moving here.
Yes.
Oh, and he's speaking of the limitations of modern man only. Anyway, his consciousness therefore orients itself chiefly by observing and investigating the world around him, right? It's all externally based and derived, and it is to the latter's peculiarities that he must adapt his psychic and technical resources. And we have brackets here, questions on how technology and media and its habits have further, this is outside, right? This is just our commentary.
Yeah, that's my commentary.
Questions on how technology, media, and the habits of its consumption have further split and divided man's consciousness, right? It influenced our thoughts and our buying habits, among other habits. This task is so exacting and its fulfillment so profitable that he forgets himself in the process, losing sight of the instinctual nature and putting his own, and this is maybe Nietzsche saying, the strength of our instinct becomes weakened when we become conscious of it. And we discussed this in Emerson. Emerson said the same thing in his own words, losing sight of his instinctual nature and putting his own conception of himself in its place of real being, right? This is like talking in terms of living an abstract reality rather than an actual understanding of why you're motivated the way you are and what moves you and affects you the way it does. So it's actually asked more than most people can fulfill, right? Most people don't have much self-knowledge, and if they do, it comes at a terrible price. On to the rest of it. In this way, man slips imperceptibly into a purely conceptual world where the products of his conscious activity progressively take the place of reality.
And that's arguably the most important part of this whole quote.
Yeah, because this is the culmination where we just kind of lose sight of self and function and meaning. Like, when you're living in an abstract world, like, what, meaning actually ceases to matter there, and it actually becomes harder to find meaning in all this abstract cosmology and symbolism and nonsense,
Well,
all these
most of our
projections.
world is abstract. I
Yes,
mean,
and that's okay. Well, you're right, because it's subject to our thoughts and feelings anyway, right? And you see that to
yeah,
the degree we have internal voices, the voices of our ancestors external and our own inner voice, it's like again, you see that these voices affect people and they drive them crazy, or they, that they, again, back to our like something like trauma or PTSD having
yeah,
this weight and effect on our psychology, for the things people say and do, it's like their regrets, their conscious, not just their
yes.
consciousness, their conscience, right? It weighs on people. It affects them.
It keeps me company.
Yeah, right. Like and a lot of people, depending on where they come from, they can have a hard time. I don't want to say reprogramming or getting out of or not listening to a lot of the bulk and excess of the negativity of a lot of those voices. It's like, look, if you were to take your dictates from the modern zeitgeist, man, it's just, dude, it's neuroticism and fear and hatred. And like, dude, it's a lot of that. Like, sure, there's good things in the zeitgeist predicated on the larger civilizational zeitgeist that precedes the modern media aspect of it that projects itself outward. But at the same time, it's like, again, you look at the news, so much misinformation, so many lies, so much fear, so much propaganda.
Yeah, well, and you'll hear people, like some people talk, um, and they'll say things that are just so like, fuck, dude, like you really just said that? Like, come on.
What in terms of like you just said, it's back 200 years of human evolution, like kind of like this
Yeah, well,
stuff
it
like
just sounds
you're
so
living in the cave ages.
negative. It's just
Oh,
so
well,
hateful, I
okay. I
guess.
would say negative,
It,
like barbaric, is in like they're actually trying to hurt people, like they're being malicious and hateful and spiteful, or like negative is in because like there's that side of it, which I guess, look, honestly, again, that is stepping backwards, right? That's going where we're regressing to our cave age physiology, right? In such cases.
yeah, well, it's not like wanting to hate people or not wanting to hurt people, but they'll say things that makes it sound as if they completely just don't understand them whatsoever. The people that they're talking to or
Oh, you
talking
mean
about,
like
or
belying like a certain like naivete and or a certain like just complete lack of understanding on something of
yes,
right. It's kind of it's like okay, problem of homelessness. Oh, why don't we just give them all? We got a bunch of houses that no people in them. Just put them in there. It's like yes, it's all well and good until they burn. Until a crackhead lights a fire and burns it down. It's like it happened. It happens
yeah.
in the best of times.
Yeah, or well, just one, people will say things to others without any sort of recognition of the effect of what they just said and how they said it affects the other person.
Oh, sure,
If that makes any
sure.
sense.
Oh, sure. And it could be extreme cruelty, or it could be
Yeah,
vanity and that kind of manipulation of like, oh, you're buttering them up, right? It could be you talking about like any kind of, or I don't know if you're talking about some approach in particular.
it
Like if we're talking about again something hateful, where it's like they're saying something very uncivilized, but in a very civilized way, like
yes,
this Orwell's territory of
yes.
like he talks about the euphemism of someone trying to like talking about the Soviet approach where they're basically just condoning murder. It's like, well, this is a very civilized way to say, like we can't say we approve of murder and genocide, but if you want to support the Soviets in such a manner, it'd be no different if you said it of the Nazis, right? That when it comes to these one-sided idealisms that often end poorly.
Well, I mean, you'll hear people. Okay, so I was watching a movie with someone. I'm not going to say who, but uh, there was this dilemma. It was basically a real life trolley problem where the US military was in Africa and then they had to blow up these people with some drones. Uh, these like terrorists with some drones, and they were in this house. And right outside of the house there was this little girl who was selling bread. So their argument was we should blow up the house, like even if it kills the girl, it'll save the people that these terrorists
Well,
are going to go
you
kill.
know that that's the same well, criminals, terrorists, and the government all seem to think the same because it's always like, well, what's collateral damage, and what is it? You were in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's not our fault. Maybe we'll
Yeah,
pay you out, maybe we won't. But I was gonna say because jihad follows a similar rationale that when you kill a bunch of people, it's like whether or not they were believers in Allah, it's like, well, you're sending them back to your maker, their maker. If they were good, they're going to get to heaven anyway. They're getting what they wanted. Like, right? Like, there's this rationale anyway. If they were non-believers, then they deserve to die and go to hell anyway, right? Like, it's like it's really easy to justify anything, really.
Yes. Well, so and
That's the
then,
damnedest thing about human consciousness and the fact that we're not entirely rational.
well, the person that was supposed to press the button, he said to his commander, we can't do this. We'll kill that little girl. And then the person who I was watching the movie with was like, just like, man, they're so stupid. They should just blow them up and kill them, and it'll save those people. And then I'm thinking like, dude, there's a fucking like little girl right there. No, like no.
Yeah, yeah, but you tell me, you drop a A-bomb on Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Is it worth it to end to stop the war already? After years of madness already, like the world had seen enough, and like it ends with a new horror, right? Like
Well,
in
yes. I
terms of
mean, I
human history.
100% agree with you, and I agree that the right decision is probably to say blow up the terrorists before they go and kill 50 more people instead of one little girl.
Yeah.
However, the lack of thought and consideration of the little girl is the thing that I'm mainly talking about.
Or you mean that we can just repress her away, that we can fully put her out of consciousness? Because I
Yes.
obviously in that question, the person who did pose the question is conscience, right? And this is what we were talking
Yes.
about earlier, the individual choices. It's like, look, you're just even if you're just following orders, even if you're just going along to get along, it's like, look, you're going to be affected.
Yes.
You're not your identification or hiding behind the herd. It doesn't exempt you from its effects on you.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, I
Let's
mean,
let's continue.
yeah, okay, no, I mean it's good food for thought. It all falls in line. So where were we? You want to please take
Quote,
us away.
separation from his intellectual nature inevitably plunges civilized man into the conflict between conscious and unconscious, spirit and nature, knowledge and faith. A split that comes pathological the moment his consciousness is no longer able to neglect or suppress his intellectual side.
Oh, instinctual
Unquote.
side. Yeah,
Oh,
and let me add a quick
instinctual
qualifier
side.
here.
Yeah.
Let's say like okay, this is since God died. This concept here and this notion, like it only matters in the advent of God's death. It's like why are we even talking about these things? Because God's dead and our instincts were weakened and we can no longer unconsciously give ourselves to unbelievable beliefs. We are no longer as innocent in the naivete of our species childhood and our
Yeah.
middle period of history, right? We're not like to the degree that us modern men have changed or been changed by, I don't know, right, however you want to word it, right? Even if we call it eternal recurrence, even if it is all, as the Buddha Zen says, even if it all is just the recurring dance of this dragon, and then the teachings of the intellectuals are just the, passing of the changing seasons, right? Like dust in the wind, really. Even within that, this is where this becomes relevant, right? Like to someone who can just kind of go through life and go along to get along or find solace in their beliefs and their ideals, whether they, actually have a rational understanding of the world and man's larger civilizational zeitgeist or not. This is where it all comes into frustration. This is where the process of civilization itself and its industrial processes have clearly agitated and frustrated the individual's own endeavor. But then to the degrees an individual obsesses with the government and with politics, or because it is funny that in a country, of independent people in independent states whose local policies are far affected more by local politics than federal politics, except in cases of overreach, federal overreach, right? Like that's when that comes into conflict. It's like
Yeah.
in theory, this country is set up to give people and states as much autonomy as possible, right? We see that the larger forces and populations get, the harder it is to wield that, the more regulations you implement to control people, yet the more people rebel and the more information is disseminated. So it's really interesting. This modern civilizational experiment is going quite, I'm not going to say it's going well, but it's going interestingly. Right,
Yeah.
there's right, like there's a lot of data to be mined here in human behavior and phenomenon. So, I had to say that in context of what Jung is saying. I'll read this part and then you read the next part. So
Okay.
this split personality brings the shadow to the forefront and the masses herd up to bring about a revolution. Jung gives the example of the Nazis and the communist revolution, and I pointed out, the shadow is not just something evil. And I
Yes.
guess we discussed this last time, right? It's primordial, formless. It's just as much it should be just as much our friend as our enemy. You know what I mean? Like it's just
Yeah.
or something that you would want to love just as much as something you'd want to give a little bit of space and breath and caution of, just like, you have hands with hands you can hug someone and with hands you can strangle someone, right?
Absolutely.
No different than any other part of our body or any other tool that we employ in our world, or even art, maybe. Like art can inspire someone, or if it's really cynical and shitty, it can kind of demoralize them, right?
Yeah,
This power kind of goes throughout our whole human cosmos, I think.
I know you haven't read The Stranger by Albert Camus.
No, I've read that one.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Okay.
No,
Well,
no, it is a modern work
oh, I'm
exploring
thinking
the
of
power.
Keegan. I'm thinking of Keegan. He hasn't read it, I don't think. But when I read that book in high school, well, we all had to read it. A lot of people said, "Man, this book sucks. I hate it. You know, this guy's a sociopath." And then I'm thinking, "Man, I can really relate to this guy."
You may keep that to yourself, huh? But oh yeah, this guy, he's terrible, horrible. No, well, he's. I told you before that I thought what's most profound about that book to me is that, again, he's the stranger, he's the outsider, and that he refuses all like his
Yes.
society and his people. It almost framed, honestly, it makes them look like the sociopaths because they're the one,
Yes.
despite his actions and him having seemingly no good reason, they try to excuse him at every route. They try and forgive him at every route. It's like he
Yes.
wants to be crucified almost, right? If
Yeah.
it does follow a Western tradition.
Well, I mean, he basically said, like, "Hey, I mean, I
Excuse
killed
me.
him." And then,
Yeah, but I mean, think about it. They're like, come on, like if you say like, but then the people, they made these other observations of this trial, but like, surely you're a little bit stressed. Surely, like they give him outs, but he's kind of a dick. He's kind of a Socrates. It really is the course he takes, but I don't want to,
yes, it
I don't want to
is.
spoil it too much. So we'll keep moving though.
The West attempts to
Yeah,
proclaim that man has no shadow and that the evil is elsewhere. You know, it's not within us.
always outside ourselves.
And so we're unable to reconcile with this darkness that's inside of us. And man blames evil on external forces and not the internal mind, which then alienates him from the root of evil. And because of that, he can't defend himself against it, against evil, at
Right.
least. And that's a
It's almost, and
paraphrasing.
again, it seems ironic, right? Like, people think they should fear things outside themselves, and it's like, no, you are immediately probably the most dangerous thing in your environment. That's not outside you. You know what I mean? That's not some external
Exactly.
projected. Like you are the most immediate force to be reckoned with. You are the potential time bomb.
Yeah,
And
well, we need to understand the consequences of our own actions and
right.
how
Oh, well,
they.
yeah, how they affect ourselves and each other, right? Because depending
Yes,
on, again, like there's these old notions of, depending on, you can create, again, if the state manufactures anarchists and communists and all that, then you could say individuals manufacture their own, maybe it could be their own inevitable doom by the creation of their enemies. Someone comes out after revenge or something for the way
yes,
they've been treated. It's like it's hard to say. It's hard not to look at human behavior, human history, and especially human religion, and say, wow, what goes around does seem to come around. Like once a blood feud starts, like these people, they don't want to stop killing each other. And it was kind of the big deal about civilization was this middleman intermediary of an authority that exists as a theoretical neutral party to mediate out conflict. And it's
yes,
pretty profound for, one of a few handful of great apes.
yeah. I mean, it's like a real life God.
Yeah, pretty much. And our stories reflect it thus. So let's see. He can't defend himself against it. He almost compares the psychic unconscious to God in the sense that it's an objective basis by which the subjective personality and its decisions are derived upon. He insinuates that one should both understand and trust the unconscious as the religious man would do so with God. Jung ends here with, quote, here each of us must ask, have I any religious experience in immediate relation to God and hence that certainty which will keep me as an individual from dissolving in the crowd? And this is him bringing back the personal bulwark against the larger weight of the mass external crushing forces.
Yes, man against the machine.
Yeah, yeah. The machine is supposed to, I'm not going to say esteem us, but at least protect us and preserve us. Yet when it's the same thing that also consumes and easily destroys us or represses and alienates us, it's like shit again. That's the animal becoming too good at its own game, right? That's
Yes.
jumping the shark. Or Sharknado, Sharknado number 5, the absolute sharkpocalypse. So
Well, I mean, civilization, it becomes so big that it kind of becomes its own entity, its own sort of its own artificial intelligence.
yeah, Sharknado 7, the
Yeah.
Sharknackening. Right, we just further abstract and kind of render ourselves further kind of like if public welfare is to matter, then when you see in American history and discourse that it's so harmful, hostile, whether it's aspects of our legal system or our I like our governmental systems, but man, the crazies and geriatrics we got running the joint, it's embarrassing the people who run our country. It's like, man, like I could think of a handful of Americans put in there and it'd be like, oh, dude, you'd have people being proud to be American in a second if you put these combination of people in there. And I don't
Yes.
I don't just mean like reality TV stars. I mean, hopefully competent people. We'll keep going here.
You want to say your comment?
Which comment was that comment?
You said it appears that with questions like this,
Oh, yeah, yeah. Okay, so it appears that with questions like this, he equates nature as something divine and worth our understanding, and our connection to it can give us a firm grounding by which we can hold on to whenever there is an external force that is trying to absorb or coerce us. Okay, I remember this story about a Vietnamese Buddhist monk who was being tortured, I want to say, by Americans. And he was just a Buddhist monk, but he was being tortured. And he said what he is a Buddhist, what he hated the most about that and what he feared the most was when in the course of this torture, he began to hate the people who were doing this to him because
yes,
he saw that as a loss of who and what he was, right? And that was a giving over to like the one thing that you don't want to like as a Buddhist, it's almost the very first thing the Buddha says in the Dhammapada. It predates Christ, but it's the same premise.
yeah,
Good, like evil begets evil. This is ancient. Only love can be, and it's got its own context and translation in Pali compared to English, but the words that generally used in most cases are love and hate or towards these compassionate moral aspects and ends. But the fact that it was the first thing in Buddhism, which emerged 500 years before Christianity, shows you that ethics and morality, in terms of the human weight of psychological effects on inflicting damage on each other, that it almost always demands a response. Like we can't
yes,
help ourselves but react and respond to the violence done against us. And
yes.
all animals fear the whip, right? It gets them moving, it gets them angry, right?
Self-knowledge.
And then, yeah, Nietzsche and Emerson speak to this, obvious as to why, the larger sentiment here, why it gives us grounding, keeps us from being absorbed by external powers. So this brings us into self-knowledge. And now we're actually getting towards the end here. The last few pages of our notes, I think we can round it out quite nicely here in the next hour. Go ahead and take us away, please.
Okay, so the answer to the question from section 5, quote, to this question, there's a positive answer only when the individual is willing to fulfill the demands of rigorous self-examination and self-knowledge. If he does this, he will not only discover some important truths about himself, but will also have gained a psychological advantage. He will have succeeded in deeming himself worthy of serious attention and sympathetic interests. This is certainly not to say that what we call the unconscious is identical with God or is set up in his place. It is simply the medium from which religious experience seems to flow. As to what the further cause of such experience may be, the answer to this lies beyond the range of human knowledge. Knowledge of God is a transcendental problem, unquote.
Yes. Questions of the self are also a transcendental problem. Look to our oldest
Yes.
philosophers and wise men. Like people have been suffering, thus seeing these same problems time and again since recorded civilization. It's
Since we
literally a
could
record.
suffer.
Yeah, and it is a record of warfare and suffering and all these. It's a record of many things, but it does include that. So the question is, when men have been banging and screaming their heads against the bar, trying to find their way out and their escape from the pain and suffering for so long, to fabricate a abstract theoretical fix in the face of these most ancients of sufferings. This is, I guess, where Jung really gets into describing these things as the infantile wish of the modern mass man, right? That they really are, and Nietzsche speaks to that kind of naivete of the last man, right? And that kind of lying pernicious spirit of the last man who wants to think that despite history showing us otherwise, again, that somehow in 2,000 years of modern civilization, that now we've overcome the worst of our destructive impulses, in our animal nature. And it's like, no, we haven't, that hasn't been achieved. Like we are not, we're still in the middle. Like we're barely out of the Middle Ages still. And it's like, dude, to go from the Middle Ages to the space age, that's pretty far. We could have been, depending on how repressive a government and society is, like we could have probably been with swords and shields for like another, couple hundred years if we wanted, really.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like if we would have been just a little bit more Luddite, like and regressive in our thought and belief and our scientific understanding, like we could have extended the Dark Ages longer. And I just say that to say, and even right now, it's like I think, technically speaking, I think we are in a dark age, and we're in a dark age despite the proliferation of information, and that's because there's so much fear and division and so much propaganda that it's like people's minds almost become broken. It's hard to fault anyone for falling in with certain cult leaders and beliefs and personality. You know what I mean?
Well, so there's this, I know what you mean, but there's this Carsey Blanton song. It's called Smoke Alarm. And there's this line in there. It's your body is an animal, let it out to play.
Yeah. See, the artist, Nietzsche says that the artist hides our bad conscience, right? There's the perfect
Yes.
example of saying, hey, no, let it out and play.
Yeah, because, well, like, so long as we have a physical body, we're always going to be animals.
Oh yeah, this is crucial, right? The mind is the body. They're not separate. We don't want to separate it.
Yes, exactly.
Like it's to only, I think that only further physiologically damages us. And I actually don't understand. Well, I wish I did. I don't know the extent at which such dualistic and kind of, what do you call it? You,
Simplistic,
well, dualistic yet simplistic yet,
dogmatic.
yeah, what the effects are on the psyche. To it, maybe we just keep going. Yeah.
Yeah. So at least in I think this is my view on it. Uh, it's that Jung, he's kind of declaring God as more of a feeling than an idea, image, or a belief. At least it seems to me that Jung believes God is a point by which the
Yeah, well,
individual
I think
fully
he's
understands
trying to
himself.
safeguard. He's trying to safeguard it. He's trying to say,
Yes.
hey, before you throw this baby out with the bathwater, like let me present this in the best scientific and rational point of view I can, so you can
Yes.
understand that these are physiological evolutionary matters, and we don't get to just pretend like, there is no year zero. We didn't just wake up yesterday free from the fearful and easily vindictive nature of our physiology and our feelings.
Well, he's also just making sure that, for one, religious people don't take God, literally
Oh,
as in the
yeah,
creator. And
right. He
so atheists
prevents.
don't take it that way either,
Right.
right?
Yeah, that's what I mean. Right. Yeah, yeah. He's trying to set it into a position that's beyond reproach, or let's say at the very
Yeah.
least, like he's taking it seriously to say like, hey, dropping the shitty, cynical, and simple criticisms that are easy to leverage. Like understand that again through both sides of the factor, both human consciousness and its evolutionary functions and instinctual functions, that these things serve a purpose. And
Yes.
any evolutionary psychologist or any psychologist worth the salt's, right? You wouldn't even need to call him an evolutionary because he'd already think that way, right? Historically evolutionary, these are the benefits of education, is that
Yes.
we can understand these things from their contextual perspective, in the sense that we didn't just emerge in a vacuum, that we do have limiting factors inside and outside of us. Oh, and this also gets in our discussion last time. The problem with one-sided ideals is they tend to want to do away with limitations, and it's like, no, once more, there's a reason why within society there's supposed to be limitations on individuals, collectives, and states. That's something we can reiterate time and again, that, like no matter how you try and instruct people thus, there's always like idealists who are like, no, if we get together like a big herd and just like maybe attack each other, or try and kill all these people or destroy all of this thing, like maybe something good will happen. It's like, no, guys, it usually doesn't work that way. It's usually violent and destructive, but and terrible,
Yes.
and has bad results or dangerous results. But again, revolutionary thinkers, right? What's a few cracked eggs? Like this experiment is ours to run. Like, what's it matter if a few million people need to starve? So yes, Jung declares God as a feeling, an idea, image, belief. It seems to me Jung believes God is the point by which the individual fully understands himself. It is the moment of clarity. I have some commentary here. I think most sages and religious thinkers, if sincere, and not assuming they're, not, we're not being cynical here, not assuming they're being manipulative and abusive. If they're sincere and that they at least believe in themselves and what they're teaching, they articulate that internal condition and relate it to others who recognize it in themselves and who are able to follow suit or, try to understand.
Yes. So he seems to speak of political polarity and how it is extremely difficult to make oneself understood by others unless they have some sort of far-reaching understanding of the other side.
That's
And this is,
it's a good point, right?
yeah, it's really hard to articulate yourself to other people unless you really understand their side, because then you won't be able to say it in their language, if that
Well,
makes
I think
sense.
yeah, right, because you otherwise just talk past each other or shut each other, right? You like it's that
Yeah.
immediate, it's almost like enemies immediately, and we won't be able to meet on any common ground in space. Whereas, I'd say the larger point of civilization is to provide the common grounds and basis upon which people can, occupy similar idealistic and mental spaces as well as physical spaces, right? Again, we're complex animals,
Yes.
not just physical spaces. We do have a psychological space, and that becomes clear in ideological warfare. Hereditary seems like it's pretty simple, like, oh, it's just against the body, but then ideological reveals like, oh, look how twisted we are. We don't just hate people for what they are. We hate them for who they are. We don't just hate them
Yes.
for the way they look. We hate them for how they think and feel on the inside. And to me, that's just twisted. To me, that's like double duty on hatred of life and man. Like a real aspect to our like savagery and our barbarity and our potential for just an utter disregard for life. To some people, it's like the worst thing in the world you could be as a racist. To me, it's honestly ideological, because like ideological in theory transcends the other, right? Because if we
Yeah.
could share mental space, then it doesn't matter what you look like or sound. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, no, we think and believe towards the same direction. We can work towards the same. So to me, ideological hatred actually seems to be the worst. The other one might just be older and more cave age. Maybe these modern sophisticates, maybe that's why they have such an aversion to it, is it reminds them too much of their ugly selves.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, it's like looking in the mirror to not admit the beast is you. Again, it's always externalized, right? The evil is always externalized.
Yeah, well, it's a bigger problem in our society is, I guess, politicists, or like however you would say that.
Political hatred.
Yeah, yeah, I mean political hatred or even religious hatred.
Yeah, and I'll say
Uh,
this, the mockery before it became much more heated in this country. It's like, dude, the mockery and the derision has been there for decades, right? Like these political, like, there's always been animosity between the left and the right, the urban and the rural, or yeah, urban and the rural. Like, there's always been the classes, right? There's always been these divides in American culture and society. It's part of why we have such a great. It's why comedy was invented here. Why modern comedy was invented here, because it was modern performers thinking in a different direction, observing all these incongruities and all this shit you
yes.
can't reconcile, like democracy yet representative republic, like human rights yet terrible working conditions and violent, like all these things. So I guess keep moving here though.
Go for it.
The
Misunderstanding.
misunderstanding and neglect of the human psyche will result in catastrophe, as mass psychosis and psychic infection will spread and result in great suffering. Yes, so too can self-understanding and goodwill spread. Yeah, yeah, he does make that case, doesn't he? This is actually the task
Yeah.
that is before us. It's our new education. And he gets to that later, talking about, why America's so vulnerable to one-sided idealism and the ideologies like communism. And he talks about all these things that kind of are meant to educate and set people against it, but which also provide little resistance in other manners.
Well, you know who Daryl Davis is?
Yeah, I've thought about that guy. For people who don't know, he's a black dude. Obviously, he's more than, he's not just a black dude. He does other things, but most remarkably is that he's befriended people who were in the Klan, right? White supremacists. And again, in terms of psychological, mumbo jumbo here, I would say whatever ticking time bomb or hatred that might have been racial in these men whom he befriended and who kind of he de-radicalized, you could say, like he
Yes.
disarmed the bomb that was their mind, right? Like he set
Yes.
this thing to rest. Like these people were kind of neurotic and obsessed in this weird way about these other people and race, and the way that, what's the difference? You hate a large mass of people. Why? Their skin color? No, for what they think and feel. It's like, wow. Like, one, they can't help. That seems pretty bad. The other one, you could say maybe they can help, but I'd say, again, judging human behavior and nature, it's like, no, most people can't help where they're at,
It's
psychologically
hard to
speaking.
change your beliefs and how you
Yeah,
think.
well, well,
brainwashing
especially,
deal.
well, think if you were born into a cult and they brainwashed you to think that, I don't know, like, God's an alien in the comet, in the tail of a comet, like you never know where someone's coming from. It can be really hard to surmount certain psychological or internal barriers or experiences.
But we
So,
can't like neglect people's human psyche
oh
or
yeah,
no,
yeah,
this
yeah.
is
Well,
all no.
you brought up Daryl Davis. No, I was gonna say, dude, it's incredible what he did, because most
Yeah,
people's reaction is, if going into a situation I know you hate me and you're against me, then I'm gonna play my hand, and my hand is also fuck you, and also I want to hurt you too, and that
yeah,
to he assumes the goodwill that's supposed to exist between civilized people in good faith by freedom of association in a modern civilized country by America, is that there's a little bit of goodwill assumed by person on both sides. Imagine doing that work double duty of going, I'm going to take it all from myself in a thankless job to befriend someone or educate, whatever it is that he think, that he was doing, then that he did. It's pretty incredible. Like
well he
I think your average person is too small to do that. Your average person is too reactive and neurotic to do that. You know what I mean?
yeah,
They don't have enough goodwill. They don't have enough forethought. They don't have enough insight, and you name it.
well he's recognizing one that what these people need is someone to listen to them, and also what they need is exposure, because they've basically separated themselves from all other people that are different than them. And by separating themselves from them, they've grown to fear them, and they've grown to hate them.
Right, dude. And look, I hate to say it, but this reminds me of one of my favorite psychological experiments with rats, where you take two rats who know each other, and you trap one, and you put the other one nearby. It's like if they know each other, that rat will free that rat 100% of the time. If the rat doesn't know each other, it doesn't know the other rat, like it won't free it. And so
Yeah,
exposure to the other rats leads it to 100% of the times this one rat will free the other rat from this little, not cage, it's like a little, a holding device, but it's like this little
yeah,
lever. And so it'll recognize and try and free its rat every single
exactly.
time. And then when it doesn't recognize the rat, it's just like, nope, I'm gonna pass them by. So, and again, it's not a one-to-one psychology, obviously, for humanity, but are we at, quote, since it is universally believed that man is merely what his consciousness knows of itself, he regards himself, oh yeah, this part's hilarious. He regards himself as harmless, and so adds stupidity to iniquity. He does not deny that terrible things have happened and still go on happening, but is always, quote, end quote, the others who do them. And when such deeds belong to the recent or remote past, they quickly and conveniently sink into the sea of forgetfulness, and that state of chronic woolly-mindedness returns, which we describe as quote end quote normality. Wow, what an insulating thought to just call this normality and go, wow, do you, again, I guess this is the historical price of normality. And what
Yeah.
Jung is talking about here is that modern man does have a hard time reckoning to all the horrible things that have happened in both the recent past and the far past. Like
Well,
that,
it's like
he doesn't
with COVID.
recognize that he's the same potential dangerous being.
Yeah.
He thinks he's above it. He thinks he's more moral than that. He thinks he's above doing any of the horrible, whether it's slavery or racism or ideological hatred or utopian thinking that leads to one-sided idealism that destroys an entire country.
Well, I mean,
They
with
don't,
COVID
again,
19,
oh, sure, go on.
uh, with COVID-19, everyone thinking, man, I can't wait for this to be over. Then finally, it's almost like basically over. And then Putin attacks Ukraine, and it was like, what the fuck? It's like,
Oh, I know. I remember. Yeah, no, people want to get back to normal. It's like, dude, guy, like that term is transitory, man. That's like a phase of the moon. It comes and it goes. And
yeah,
dude, our sense of normal back in the '90s is like so gone. Like from the '80s is so gone. Even the early aughts is so gone. Like we are,
yeah,
like it's crazy how much our social zeitgeist and climate has changed.
yeah. And I wish I knew how what it was like to live without
Oh,
cell
dude,
phones and computers. And
you know how little fucks like so many people gave about politics and government. Like it was working well enough at the time that it could see, like a good government works quietly in the background, right? It doesn't constantly disrupt itself with lies and propaganda and scandal, right? Like ideally, and like I remember as kids, like so many kids, like they were able to kind of focus more, be their own thing, do their own thing, and there's a certain aspect to. And they didn't necessarily care for the politics, and to the degrees that again the state has agitated people towards these ends, and everyone wants to vie for political power. It's like, it's sad to see that to me it looks like kids being robbed of their childhood in a certain sense. if that makes
Yes, it
sense.
is. It is
To
exactly
put
what it
upon
is.
them with these political slogans. And I remember they were doing, I mean, look, and I remember they like, and I guess this country's always been political and it has a long history of kind of stunts like this, so again, I don't want people to mistake that like a lot of what's happening in America is new or novel. It's like, no, it's if it
Yeah.
hasn't happened in America already before, then it's happened in some other civilization before, in
Yeah.
terms of
Well,
behavior. But
it's
the new aspects, like you pointed out, it is mass communication. That again, that's only further complicates everything. It gives our neuroses like a megaphone, right? It's like it's almost
yeah,
like a steroid,
it
an anabolic
is.
steroid for
It is.
our neuroses and for our, and I guess you could say maybe for some of our good stuff too, right? Battle forth and say no, but what about this? But again, what's it matter when you're up against the zeitgeist, when you're up against all of public opinion and the status quo,
Yeah. Do you
or
want to
as
read
we just
your
as we just said, the quote unquote normal. What
this young
let's get
Ion
up. Oh yeah,
quote?
okay. So Young, and I just because like you said, this is a summation of a lot of Young. And in Ion, he says, "quote And there are always optimists who believe that the golden age can be ushered in simply by telling people the right way to go." And think about it. It applies to politics. It
Yeah.
applies to psychology, right? Oh, just stop being neurotic, right? Oh, just be more socialistic, right? Just be more this, be more that. But just let him try to explain to these people that they're acting like a dog chasing its own tail. To make a person see the shortcomings of his attitude considerably more than mere quote unquote telling is needed. For more is involved than ordinary common sense can allow. What one is up against here is the kind of fateful misunderstanding which, under ordinary condition, remains forever inaccessible to insight. It is rather like expecting the average respectable citizen to recognize himself as a criminal, right? They're not going to do it. They're going to say, no, I know what morality is. I know what goodness is. I can recognize it in others. I see it in them. It's out there. It couldn't be me. I'm not evil. Badness isn't inside me. It's almost like our perception is required that we think of ourselves as superior beings. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Lest we lest we be honest about how tiny, banal, and petty we really are.
Yeah.
Like, no, I am noble. I am big. I am something bigger than I am. And again, when the whole force of the zeitgeist tells you to the opposite. I remember some of the nastiest people I ever met were like these sociopathic yet brilliant young political thinkers. And one of them told me, he said to me, "You are nothing." And I was like, yeah, that's brilliant. That's, as a communist, that should totally be your party line. The individual is nothing. Absolutely. I understand what you mean, brother. You know, like you are mad about your perceived powerlessness in the world and these mass forces which control your life more than you do, or that direct your life more than you do. It's understandable why people feel the way they do.
Yes, it
We are all
is.
subject to these mass forces. And so
Um,
these mass forces of state and politics and otherwise stoking resentment. Again, this is ancient philosophy, right? This is ancient philosophical and political understanding. It's nothing new. It's always existed. There's always been enmity between classes and castes and in groups and out groups. So
so we never actually dealt with the issue, but instead we just swept it.
yes,
We swept it under the rug, and that's kind of what politicians do when they say
repression.
things like, "All we have to do is this," and then our society will be fixed. Like what they're doing here is they're sweeping all the other problems like under the rug, and they're saying it's just this. Like all we have to do is this. But that's what the individual does as well,
Yes, it's
because
our
they,
repetition compulsion.
yep, yep, yep. It's repetition, it's forgetfulness, and then when it
They,
returns again, we have no way of dealing with it other than how we did in the past, and that's kind of
Right,
a
and it makes sense.
nudge.
You think you solved the problem.
Yeah,
It makes sense that it would repeat because if you missed it, yet and it's if we want to think mechanically here, it's like what this is to the psyche and its effect on the human consciousness and human conscience. You have a water pipe. It's got two leaks in it. You find the one further down the line. That's good. It stops a leak there. But you completely miss that there was a leak further up. Again, a pressurized system with a leak is a problem. Like the human
yeah,
consciousness, is that pressurized system. Now you
yeah,
got a brain leak. Go
yeah.
on.
Well, I was just gonna say, and then after it is over, once again, we still just want to forget it and shove it back under the rug. So this kind of, I think, like all this really relates to present times with the current issues at hand in Ukraine, for instance.
Right.
I think for the most part, we never actually dealt with like how we should respond to stuff like this.
Oh no, you're right. Whether it was, we almost sent in people to stop the Rwandan genocide, but we didn't. And it's like, why? Well, did we have much interest there? And like how,
Yes.
and also like how would it look of think of this, like okay, you got a bunch of people hacking, a bunch of these Africans are hacking each other to death with machetes, and now we send in a bunch of like probably largely white soldiers to shoot a bunch of black people, and like that probably wouldn't have looked good. Like that would have been actually really weird if you think about it, right? And
Yeah.
because it's like okay, they're all killing each other. Now we're adding the white people to kill, and I don't mean any of this flippantly about the race stuff because I know it means a lot to a lot of people for more than one reason.
Well, I mean, I guess
We're
it's
talking about a complex history and relationships,
yeah.
and you can be cynical all you want, but I'm saying you're right that we actually do not. This is why it's hard to reconcile our government and its more supposed morality and value system because it's very pragmatic and it's very utilitarian, but we actually don't have a like we never it's never really a moral response. It's never like a principled response. It's like, well, it depends what the money market looks like. It depends on the value of the dollar. It depends on our resources, right? It depends on a lot of things, but it doesn't necessarily depend on stopping human suffering. In
Yes.
fact, I'd argue like the state's affairs almost never depend on stopping human suffering. That became an afterthought in the larger human zeitgeist. Like we kind of evolved to just function, not necessarily think too hard about it.
Yes. And well, I mean, it's all. I mean, we didn't evolve. It just came
Yeah, no, I mean
like for
it's the
no
way it's built
reason,
out. No, I
right?
mean,
I
yeah,
mean,
no, I mean, no, but I mean it's the way we kind of adapted to it was like we have a
yes.
certain amount of play within these larger complex systems, but again, everyone's power, it's always like, okay, this far and no further, right? And then we work within our equilibrium within this environment, kind of just goes from there. And we've been doing this game a long time. And by game, I mean it's our survival, so it's, a hell of a game.
It's one hell of a game.
Yeah. So
Um,
yeah, go
yeah,
on,
let me read this one.
please.
So what Jung is saying here, like slightly, is that everyone almost has like this Hitler within them, and that Hitler must be dealt with. And then I think it's funny because there's this video game that I saw on Reddit. This guy posted about. It's called Healing Hitler, where you're a Hitler's
Oh
psychologist and
yeah,
you have
no,
to get him not to
you
commit
mentioned
the
this last time,
Holocaust.
yeah.
So, quote, none of us stand outside of humanity's black collective shadow, and our, quote, lack of insight deprives us of the capacity to deal with evil, unquote.
Yeah.
Obviously, I was using some hyperbole there, like everyone has a Hitler within them. But I mean, in all reality,
Pretty much. I mean, pretty much. It's acknowledging that again that's a shadow side. That's our like you'll kill someone with your bare hands to survive if you have to side of yourself. That you're this civilized part of yourself is in a fortunate position to not have to employ most of the time. You know what I mean?
so I think yes, and I think there's an interesting way to explain this that Joe Rogan actually brought up in one of his podcasts with I think Chris Ryan and Duncan Trussell. It's that he was saying how he was on this trip in Hawaii, then he was looking at all these dolphins, and then he was saying how if he were inside of a dolphin's body, then he would basically just, well, I mean, he'd be the dolphin, right? In a sense, we're all kind of the same person or thing. The only difference is, like how our body is and our thoughts and our feelings. But at the end of the day, we're the observer and we have all these things within us that are different. And in a sense, we all have the capacity for evil because we're all kind of this. I mean, we're all
Uh-oh.
just like these things with eyes and ears and
Right, well, right. Well, I mean, dude,
thoughts and
we
whatnot.
all, like you say, like, okay, everyone has the potential to chew food, right? Everyone has the potential to,
Yes.
like, any of these biological capabilities in which we can engage in, it's like everyone has the potential to use them.
Yes.
And then believing yourself like moral and responsible just on a conscious kind of rationalized whim, especially when removed from any situation which would actually require to put that theory to the test. It's like, well, that's not morality. That's not strength. Like you're assuming you're a moral person based off the fact that like you're weak or you've never been tested or that you've had the good
Yes.
graces of been able to go along to get along all your life and you've actually never been threatened. You've never been tested. You know what I mean? Like you've never been in that situation of like, see how you feel if you've been starving a few days. See how you'll behave then. It's like
Yeah.
it's easy to speak big and speak a good game when you were protected by society. And it's like within the walls of civilization, people wind up so sheltered. It's like almost like they seem to forget why the walls existed and why the limitations delegated by authorities also exist, why there's a hierarchy. It's like,
Yes.
yeah, to keep people from meddling, to keep people from fucking up, to maintain order in a very real sense. Because without order, we die. Very tricky stuff. And balance there, and oh god, to balance it for any length of time, it's again, golden mean. Like you look at any species who's gone extinct, you can look and see in our understanding of it, like what its kind of golden mean was. Oh look, there was this time in this creature's history where it could live in its environment and exploit its resources and not wind up too hot, cold, dead, whatever, right? And with our evolution, it's like for all we know, we passed that a long time ago, and we've just been dealing with the aftermath ever since.
Yes.
Like, there's actually nowhere that is guaranteed otherwise, or this has a happy ending or works out exactly how people want it.
Well, we're always dealing with the
Yeah,
aftermath.
and with human behavior in the midst of it. So lack of insight deprives us the capacity to deal with evil. We are all both good and evil, and by this acknowledgement, we take responsibility for both our inner and good evil rather than inner good and inner evil, rather than scapegoating everybody else, right? Rather than projecting it on the outside or
Yeah.
denying within. This likewise allows us to become more sympathetic and understanding for evil actions, and this us allows to deal with it, right? This is having a healthy and strong, or Jung calls it imagination for evil, but what it is, it's a mature and adult understanding rather than the child's naive and insipid understanding. When Jung says the infantile nature of the mass man is like so insipid, on his increasing demands of the state and government and his fellow herd, he doesn't even recognize like that there's a cost to this, and he doesn't understand where it comes from. So leads us to have that imagination and that sympathy for evil. Quote, recognition of the shadow, leads to the modesty we need in order to acknowledge imperfection.
Yeah.
That, it's absurd to think, that we could be so perfect anyway, or that if only we behave this way, we're going to finally create that perfect and ideal society. It's like, dude, at this point, what a juvenile notion, to go like, you not understand the vast differences and limitations in people and their consciousness and their potential. It's like, yeah, obviously, it's a precondition for the naive assumption is a lack of, or is ignorance. And then arrogance seems to be the precondition for pathological mass movements. You get enough
Yeah.
ignorance with enough arrogance, inject that into enough people, and you got your destabilizing force, which destabilizes larger society. And the thing about
Yeah.
destabilizing society is it brings the crazies out of the woodwork, and you never know how it'll happen. Like, give you an example is John Lennon, right? So he tells the world, we the Beatles are bigger than Jesus, and he doesn't necessarily mean it in the blasphemous way. He's just saying like, hey, we're really popular right now, and it's kind of true, right? So the rest of the world hears what they hear. Maybe they hear an arrogant rock star or their favorite singer, but one crazy guy hears a mission from God and he's going to go assassinate John Lennon, right? And he did it. So it's like you never know how the zeitgeist and its projections will affect an individual, let alone the larger mass. And what one man's like his word, like somehow just him putting those words out into the ether, in theory, brought about his own ending. Do we blame him for saying it? Do we blame the crazy guy for doing it? I don't even know. Like, it actually gets really hard to, because we have such a botched relationship with cause and effect, these things, it really is hard to puzzle out. But I guess what the larger point here is just to point out, what? This is all like, we actually don't have, like, not like we have an exact science for this anyway.
Yeah.
No one's actually done the full weights and measures. Jung was barely just kicking it off here. And this was many decades ago.
Well, we may never even
Right. And
have
well, I mean,
that.
but and what we're doing is we're carrying the conversation forward. We're just continuing it.
Yes.
So he then mentions recognition of one's shadow is vital in relationships because weakness demands dependence upon other people. Quote, the perfect have no need for others, but weakness has, for it seeks support and does not confront its partner with anything that might force him into an inferior position or even humiliate him. Yeah, and honestly, it's
Yeah.
it's friendship, it's cooperation, it's not constantly using the worst of your instincts to lord yourself over someone else.
Yeah, and you can't like think that you're perfect, because if you think that you're perfect, then you're never going to want to even associate with other people because you'll think
Right.
everyone else is
Well,
wrong
look,
and you're right.
right, and even Jesus, and for Western relations, and I don't mean this cynically, I just mean this like factually. Like, theoretically, Jesus was a perfect man, but he taught others and he allowed others to follow him. He could have put himself above other people and just said, nope, like, I'm better than all you, go screw yourselves. But
Yeah.
he didn't. To translate his ideas, he had to have followers.
Yeah, and you have
But
to have humility
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
because people will recognize like, oh, this it's like no different than when animals posture for power, two bears square off, two dogs square off. It's like people will get the feeling real quick like, oh, this person's using me or this person's lording over, you know what I mean? Like
yeah,
they're definitely trying to dominate me or humiliate me. It doesn't feel good. No one likes that shit.
yeah. Well, I mean,
No, I mean
sometimes,
fundamentally, like some people might like the abuse, some people might like to inflict the abuse, but you get what I mean. I think
well, I
it's a
mean,
general
sometimes
truism.
I'll see someone treating someone else in not a very good way, and
Hmm.
then I'll say to them, "Hey, it seemed like you were kind of being mean to them." And then the thing that really annoys me is when that person just tells me, "Oh, that they deserved it," or "Oh,
No,
um,
it's like, yeah, you know what? You're right. I was being mean and they deserved it. Again, easy to
like
rationalize, right?
just like blah,
Other
like
people are
blah blah
nothing.
blah." I'm like, you fucking like, dude. Like, well, like when you have zero,
Well, it teaches you, well, doesn't it tell you to be careful of that person? Because if that's how they can treat other people, then what would make you fool yourself into thinking they can't or won't do that to you? Or maybe that they haven't and you haven't even noticed that they've behaved that way. You know what I mean? Because behaviors can be very subtle. Manipulation can be very subtle.
yeah, or maybe you do notice it and you're
Oh,
telling them
yeah.
how they're treating others so that maybe they can start to keep
Yeah,
their
no,
eye
no,
on.
yeah, of course, yeah. Oh, yeah, no, of course, yeah. If yeah, it depends on. I guess it depends on the relationship, right? Because like, look, man, I
Yeah,
have I have lots of relationships with people I've known for a very long time, and it's like, dude, they're maintained. We don't just have them. It's like we have them because we've maintained them, because we've stayed friends, because we've
yeah,
have occasionally called each other out when we felt like we were overstepping lines or whatever the
yeah,
case may be. It's necessary to keep a clean house.
yes,
Otherwise the
exactly.
trash just piles up.
Knowledge of the truth.
Yeah, we'll resume here. Knowledge of the truth is the foremost goal of science, and if in pursuit of the longing for light we stumble upon an immense danger, then one has the impression more of fatality than of premeditation. It is not that present day man is capable of greater evil than the man of antiquity or the primitive. He merely has incomparably more effective means with which to realize his proclivity to evil. As his consciousness has broadened and differentiated, so his moral nature has lagged behind. That is the greatest problem before us today. Reason alone does not suffice.
Yeah, but you can't rely on only reason, and we never actually do rely on only reason. We rely on our emotions, and we use reason to justify our emotion. At least in my view, because I
Right.
mean, so like
Yeah,
all,
that person deserved it, right?
yeah, yeah, that person deserved it, right?
We covered it. Yeah.
Or if I,
When people ask for their punishment, I mean, it's a funny thing about culture is it's kind of the thing that gives us creed to say, yeah, the crime, the punishment fits the crime. They deserve it.
yeah,
We tend not to call justice revenge, but justice is a sublimated revenge.
yeah,
It's our most profound ordering
yes.
principle, but it's like the law is no longer in your hands. If someone wrongs you, you don't get to set it right. We've sublimated it to the state. We've delegated it to the state, but it is a sublimation of your feelings into the machine. Through this mechanism, you will derive your satisfaction.
Yeah.
It's one way in which power is directly taken from the individual's hands. It's much more subtle in other cases. But in this case, we're talking about how, your own desire to, let's say, hurt someone else or to seek retribution for an action.
Yeah, and well, I mean that's kind of what I was saying earlier with how like I'll say something to someone and then they'll say, that doesn't make sense. Like I don't
They
understand.
can't understand the context in which it would be true or why it would matter or what the relevance is, all that stuff.
You have to explain your emotions with reason in a sense because whenever you're translating them into words, it has to come out.
It
So,
leads, it's a definite abstraction, right? It definitely,
yeah.
a lot of times you see you're putting, a strange burden to an even stranger cage.
Well, you have to put words in your own mouth, right?
Yeah. I mean, to
In a
be
sense.
in theory, to be understood.
Yeah. You want to go ahead with it?
These are, I mean, and these are
Sorry.
these are the dangers of, mass psychology, of mass movements, let's say, is
Yeah.
that you replace your own ability to think and reason and whatever it may be with, pre-ready-made thoughts and slogans and ideals. We talked a little bit about Orwell last time, but, he talks
Yes.
about this, that when the corruption of language is instrumental to, that you can do people's thinking and acting for them. There comes a certain point when they're speaking in jargon and terminology and preaching their idealism. It's like if there was an individual there, good luck finding them. Now you have a party representative. on these matters of mass movements, and he's speaking specifically under the threat of nuclear power, Jung says, the fear of universal destruction may spare us the worst, yet the possibility of it will nevertheless hang over us like a dark cloud, so long as no bridge is found across the worldwide psychic and political split. A bridge is as certain as the existence of the hydrogen bomb. If a worldwide consciousness, we did talk about this at the end of last episode, I think.
Yeah, I feel like we did talk about
We
it.
did, yeah. One more time here. If a worldwide consciousness could arise that all division and all antagonism are due to the splitting of opposites in the psyche, then one would really know where to attack. But even if the smallest and most personal stirrings of the individual soul, so insignificant in themselves, remain as unconscious and unrecognized as they have hitherto, they will go on accumulating and producing mass groupings and mass movements which cannot be subjected to reasonable control or manipulated to a good end. All direct efforts to do so are no more than shadow boxing, the most infatuated by illusion being the gladiators themselves.
Yeah, and then so this is a paraphrasing, but the shadow is not something wholly negative, for it is entirely worth our understanding. For truly to know ourselves, the shadow is, after all, a large part of us. And then what you said earlier is that the shadow is kind of our primordial selves. Then to be willing to understand the shadow is a bravery that brings about great power to the individual. He also seems to claim that helping one individual at a time will lead to hundreds of other individuals to be helped over the course of hundreds of years. And that's something that Daryl Davis does, right?
This what the Buddha being a very civilized and self-tamed man,
Yes.
This was Davis, I guess, could have attacked those men, but he would have only further compounded their beliefs.
Yeah, absolutely. And that would
Instead
happen
he
to me
he
when
he
I
ended
was,
it. He ended
yeah,
it. He used he didn't use the opposite force. He used an external third force. He didn't
yes,
to match it with its opposite would be another fight. He used
yeah,
the third neutral force, an outside force, to tame them, to sway them, to educate them. That is the power of our voice, of our
yeah,
being, of our words, of our articulation. I think this is what a lot of political thinkers, in terms of Western civilization and what we've always put front and center. Jung talks about it right with the word. We talked about it last time and before. But this is the logos, and I think when people have a really ineffectual voice or feel like they have no voice, it's like this is what they resort to. It's like they find their power in the crowd versus look at what a real power can do.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, like, look at what a real power can do.
Yeah, and a
And
much smaller one at that, how powerful it is.
yeah,
So not something wholly negative.
and then
So
art is possibly a gateway towards self-knowledge, for it is a universal language. And that's something that um Keegan brought up in my podcast with him, on when he brought up that Nietzsche said a lot about how art is kind of a gateway out of religion. And I think in this sense, what Jung is trying to say here is that art is kind of a gateway out of control, and towards self-knowledge.
yes, it can be. It can also be part of the control tool as well. This is art is something dangerous and art is something powerful.
Yes, it
That
too has a shadow, right?
yeah, that's a good way of putting it. So our moral backwardsness has failed to keep pace with our technological progress. Well, that much should be apparent to everyone. Another way of saying it is like our physiology is not
Yeah.
kept up with our technology. We may live in the space age, but we still behave like we're hardly out of the Middle Ages. We still have witch hunts. We still do all that stuff,
Yes.
right? So will the individual ever understand that he is to blame for the horrors of humanity? And it's like, well, if he wants to keep projecting outwards, if he wants to keep assuming he can beat the world into submission or remake it in his image, he's going to keep perpetuating these same
Yeah.
civilizational, individual, collectivist repetition compulsions. And usually it's large cycles of violence and destruction. And then creation follows, and then back to violence and destruction. Why would there be a way out? Why wouldn't it be the same thing over and over again? Like, what would actually have to change the way we do business? I don't know, but it's definitely nothing that's been exemplified today. It doesn't exist in any meaningful number or mass force that can actually constrain so many hostile forces. You know what I mean? Or unify them, or whatever theoretical terms you want to use. When people do theorize, or if only, or if then, but it's really just, those kind of statements are just, it's idealism reaching the end of its ropes, often unironically while not realizing it, right? Like, oh, if only people would behave this way. And it's like, yeah, if only, but it ain't going to happen, like
Yeah.
that kind of thing. You want to carry us on?
Sure. Quote, happiness and contentment, equability of mind, and meaningfulness of life. These can be experienced only by the individual and not the state. which on the one hand is nothing but a convention agreed to by independent individuals, and on the other, continually threatens to paralyze and suppress the individual. And then, so my thoughts on that are that people fear AI, yet the state is already its own AI of sorts. After all, it is surely an autonomous entity that acts with or without our intervention. And what I mean by that is that no one person controls the state. It kind of just exists and is operated upon in the sense that we are cells and organs of the body that is the state.
Yes, and this organism's already alive, and it was already like formed over time and set in like all the organs and
Yeah.
structures are already there. It already exists. We've already set it in motion. But it's funny that the Western Enlightenment value side of America says, okay, it's not the state's job to be responsible for you, nor is it the state's job to be responsible for your happiness. Instead, it's supposed to protect your ability to search your to seek your own fulfillment, right? Like the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the moment people start putting their infantile wish fantasies onto the state, they start saying, no, the state's supposed to provide these things. Or
Yeah.
absent community and family, the state's supposed to bind us together or be our way towards community and family. Or maybe even most horrifying, a replacement for community and family, right? Like that's where these things easily go off the rail, because again, it's the individual who experiences happiness, not the state. The consensual agreement of a mass of people might or might not serve an actual individual's well-being, and just to always assume that the collective is right, there's a serious, I guess we have a fallacy for that, right? It's a bandwagon fallacy. But the
Everyone
AI,
else is doing it.
well, and the AI comparison is good though, because you're right, because it already is. It's already its own organism. It's got its own autoimmune response built into it. Like it's got all these components. It already exists independent of us. It already acts independent of our thoughts on us. And this goes back to, that is the feeling of the individual's plight in modern society, that no matter how many votes, he has one vote, he has one voice, and it seems to be about as powerless as everyone else's.
Yeah, and a lot of times I think people feel like they're these cells that can't really move about the body. They're
Yeah,
kind
they
of just
can't.
there.
Maybe they can't even do their function, or they feel alienated from it.
Yeah.
Like, what's the point of them within this larger body? Well, I mean, that's. I think we read this from Nietzsche, right, on the Greek
Yeah.
state, when we see how little the trouble themselves after a short. So it's like the troubled may be resentful towards the state. They might go, "Oh, the state's an enemy. The state's bad," but like it's always a short hop and leap before they're like, "Okay, how do we use the state to our benefit? How do we take it over? How do we commit our long march to the institutions?" That's usually how ideological takeovers kind of go, right? Like it's usually like it doesn't happen overnight. A tyranny and an idiocracy, right? It doesn't just pop up overnight. Like it's built slowly over time. And then sometimes, it's like a slow building and then a bursting and then, has its convulsions and then it's born.
Well, so the most successful species on the planet are single-celled organisms, not multicellular organisms. There are far more single-celled organisms in the world than multicellular organisms, because multicellular organisms, they
Require a lot more fuel, number one.
yep, and they crumble a lot easier.
Oh yeah.
The bigger they are, the harder they fall.
Oh
And
yeah, and then your system will always break at its weakest point. It doesn't matter if it's electronic or biological. Our systems, like it's just funny to me. You can have a body as strong as an ox, but a toothache could easily knock you on your ass. You know what I mean? Like knock you out of commission, or any other number of, or like you're really smart, but you have a mental illness. Or something. I don't know. Like it's fate. The way fate doles out its talent, its genius, and its madness is.
No, well, what I'm trying to say here with that is that our civilization, we can't be cells in a multicellular like organism, or we'll just feel trapped and like the whole system can come crumbling down.
Yeah, no, I think we do have to have a place.
Yeah, we need to have a place, and we also need to be our own like individual thing, right?
Past Nietzsche's tightrope, it's like that is kind of the new dance, isn't it? It's like whether anyone wants it or not, it's like, yeah, how can you be okay with this? How can you be okay? And it looks to me like it's really hard for people to adjust to modern life, modern madness, modern communication, you name it. To me, like after studying and learning and all this, in my own experience in life and all these other things, it seems obvious as to why, but I also understand why it's not apparent. It's for the same reason, Jung writes this 80-page essay that, we have here in, 21, 22 pages of notes, kind of summing it up. And it's like, well, there's a lot to say and there's a lot to observe and there's a lot of information to take into account. But
go read it.
Yeah. Well, I figured we could get a few of his best quotes in here before we call it a day.
Well, and are you going to read this Nietzsche quote or skip it?
Oh, I think we read part of it last time, but the origin of culture is the state. It was having a mass of people to support a leadership class that could create the art, tell people what's what, have the luxury and the leisure to establish a culture in the first place predicated on slavery. So the thing is, it's been this long, painful process to even arrive to some novel notion like a middle class or a working poor who at least aren't in chains. You know what I mean? Like,
I think culture is kind of what people do when they're not like doing their slave duties, if that
yeah, okay, no.
makes any sense.
It's the larger civilizational playground that we're allowed to engage in when we aren't engaged in the necessity of supporting ourselves.
Yeah.
Once upon a time, we didn't have a
Yes.
choice. Most humanity didn't have a choice in that because it was either, if it wasn't just the straight slavery of a city state, of a polis, of a nation state, whatever it was, then usually it was, well, the coercion of your own culture. And if you didn't fit into it, like you had no other option. You had no other marketing team to go to. You had no other choice in medium or media or, it's like these were your people and that was that. And if you didn't fit in and they didn't accept you, you were in for a lot of trouble. So what Nietzsche says is, looking to the average or origin of culture in the state, one quote, one would indeed feel inclined to think that a man who looks into the origin of the state will henceforth seek his salvation at an awful distance from it, where one can not see the monuments of its origin, devastated lands, destroyed cities, brutalized men, devouring hatred of nations, the state of ignominiously low birth, for the majority of men a continually flowing source of hardship, a frequently recurring periods of consuming torch of mankind, and yet a word at which we forget ourselves, a battle cry. And we did read this last time, but it's worth repeating again because it's just kind of like that repetition compulsion. It's like, on one hand, people go, God, look how bad a state can be. Look at how hypocritical and terrible it can be. Now, how can we use it to benefit us? And it's like,
Yeah.
dude, you're still talking about the same consumption of men. We're still talking about the same blasted, wasted lands. These are the behaviors of a state who tries to project its border or project its power, defend its borders, and keep its people alive.
Yeah.
It really is a calamitous affair, and it really is a destructive affair and a consumptive affair. It's never been pretty, and there's no idealistic paint job you can put on it that really justifies it in any morally speaking manner. Other than just to say, you know what, like, we exist because we're great, because we're awesome. Like, generally, like, at the end of the day, look, they observed it. At the end of the day, that little girl deserved it, right? At the end of the day, she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. At the end of the day, right? Like, this is just how we do business.
Yeah.
We can look at its horrors one second and then utterly forget it the next and be like, oh, isn't this great? Or isn't this going to be good once we get things our way?
Well, it's convenient to do that.
Yeah, and it's expedient. And, it's like, I'll reserve the rights when I feel like I'm under threat, but I won't offer them to you when I have the upper hand. This is the terrible battles of people within nations. We're talking about
Yeah.
civil forces at odds, or two political parties even.
Well, it's like, sure, yeah, yay, equality, yay, freedom. And then, oh, wait, you're trying to put that stuff in my backyard? No, thank you.
Yeah, exactly. Whatever it is, yes, but keep it at a distance from me, or I don't want to have to pay for it again. Like, we want to have our cake and eat it too.
Yeah. You said a battle cry, and then, oh, I guess you read the whole thing. Never mind.
Yeah, so, in getting to
Okay.
the end here,
Yeah, the end results.
did we discuss this last time or not? I don't remember.
No, well, we never
Okay,
really got.
I just think it's the ongoing domestication and control of modern man anew. And no matter how we sublimate or retell the story, it's the same premise. Like, we're just trying to control each other.
Yeah.
These are age-old forces of tyranny, of mob rule. In its modern context, it's through a conditioning of a mass consumer class whose relationships are primarily transactional and mediated by market forces, removed from each other, overseen and regulated by the third invisible party in all relationships, which is the government itself. The personal is political, and moving in that direction was the acceleration of really a new cast of authoritarian and governmental informants and a new way of modern thought. We, the people, want to use the state to further, rather than that assumption of the founding fathers that we'll be responsible for ourselves so the government doesn't have to be. The modern American tends to often think in terms of, no, how can I use the state to my advantage? How can I use it to hurt other people even, rather than trying to handle their own business. There's the acceleration of that, but there's also modern technology that better arrests and disrupts our nature and physiology, including conscious and unconscious beliefs of this war of all against all, right? This notion that, yeah, it really is a fight for survival, so you better choose your side, and this is how mass politics and mass influence works. You spread fear, you spread propaganda, which you're actually telling people to do in these mass movements of, usually it's civil war or other war. You're telling people to choose a side. And we've seen it for years. It happened in the COVID debate, which was never a debate, right? It was just public opinion and it was the government. But we see this time and time again. So through politics, it's whether it's gender versus gender, race versus race, whether it's the mendacious race swindle or the rediscovery of pre-civilizational garbage values, like saying, hey, we're going to identify and judge each other based on the way we look, not what we actually think, feel, and how we act and how we are on the inside. The end result of all this stuff, it really is to take a step backwards in terms of modern mass civilization. It's to insist we can't occupy the same space.
Yes.
It's not just a matter of the depotentialization of people, that the modern mass state and all these mass forces further rob individuals of power. It's that within these larger power dynamics, each individual sees that the success to them getting their piece of the pie is to further cut and divide, to further render inert and inoperable, right? Because this is just how you wage a war, right? This is how you manipulate people. It's a precarious situation on one hand, but at the same time,
confusing.
And it's never, and it's not like it's never been any less precarious or confusing. But again, you see that the way modern people clamor for the government to answer all the worst problems of the day and to provide all the resources, you see that, again, where are the people who are asking, where does this come from? Who pays for it? Where does the government even get this much power? Because technically it doesn't even have it. Why do people want to give it the power? Because you realize, this is a movement of sheep. This is what sheep do. They'll bury us. They'll bury anyone and everyone. It's just what
They
mass
get
psychic
angry and then they
infections
get
do.
tired.
Yeah,
Right?
well, I mean, and maybe, there is the complacency therein and the exhaustion therein and the obvious and the movement itself. While usually political ideologues see their movement as bound for success, and it's like, no, your movement itself was the very sign of the decline. It was a symptom of the decline. Your belief and thinking was a luxury that was afforded in the decline. And again, so it really is a large repressive alienating structure. So it makes sense that so many people have a hard time being happy therein. But delegating power and responsibility outside yourself, it's the definition of the problem in the first place.
Yeah.
And I guess maybe that's kind of the modern orgy. Maybe that's just you forget yourself. You can lose yourself in that. And you can just be one with the crowd. If you've ever been at a big crowd and then found yourself kind of outside of it or looking at it from the outside, it's actually quite terrifying, You go, oh, wow, look at all that energy. Like it would take one accusation maybe to start a huge brawl here. Like you could feel the energy, right? You could like light a match off it.
Well, I mean, that's how I feel every time that I'm in a crowd.
Oh, that energy, that kind of like you could literally be explosive.
I get in and then I think, man, these people are scary.
You get in and then went out. Yeah, I'm in, now I'm out. Because I wanted in, now I'm out.
It's like, oh God. Well, I mean, and I need, in order to be in any sort of crowd like that, I need some sort of inebriation. Or otherwise I'm way too sensitive to all the noises.
Yeah, it kind of is like being, inebriation is a good term because it is like being if you're a sober person watching a bunch of people who are a bit too drunk, it's like they're not that impressive. Whatever grandiose feelings the drunk has, it doesn't look that grandiose right from the outside. It's like whatever he feels though, it looks like it feels awesome, right? I love you, man, that kind of stuff,
Yeah,
but you look at
try being on LSD at a party, and it's like, what the fuck are these people doing?
Oh, that sounds like it could be dangerous. But man, I knew people would take it and go to like Disneyland and shit. And you tell me, man, that's madness. Like, how do you deal with that? I'd go insane. You'd find me crying under the bridge probably, like, or in Kitty. I don't know I don't remember the places what they're called. Space Mountain. So let's see.
So I actually had this little aphorism that I wrote that kind of relates to why it's so hard to stay focused on trying to be an individual in society.
Sure.
If you don't mind me reading it.
Please do.
I opened my eyes to the millions of stars that light above me. There was no real rival to their magnificence. At the sight of them, one could almost feel the collective awe that has walked over humanity since our ancestors first looked up upon them. One could feel their wonder, glory, and humbleness as they casted their eyes at this conglomerate of twinkling lights whose sources were more distant than anything humankind would ever even hope to reach. What adds most heavily to their greatness was that one could always be sure to see them if the sky was clear. They felt permanent. And within this permanent vastness of endless mysterious beauty, one thought that what lied within them were the answers to everything. The stars were, to our human feelings, something all-knowing, irrevocably mysterious, permanent, endless, and of supreme beauty. Alas, that they were God, for God is always a word used to describe that which felt to be all-knowing, irrevocably mysterious, permanent, endless, and of supreme beauty. In the presence of such a God, one felt themselves to be nothing more than a grain of sand in an infinite desert. So one often found themselves in an ominous yet exciting trance of surrender as they stared up upon the stars, as they glared up upon the gods. People exclaimed such things as, "That's God up there, that's God," for they felt that contagious, all-powerful essence of that which, for lack of a better term, could only ever be called God. In that sense, we use God to describe those things that provoked within us a feeling of sublime surrender. That is, we felt immersed and at one with its supreme power and beauty, so much so that in those times of sensing God, we almost felt inexistent, for our errors of our intuition pointed towards a feeling of godliness, to the extent that we became gods ourselves. I yawned and decided it was time to go back to sleep. I suppose that not even God was powerful enough to overcome the needs of the physical body, or indeed could be what indeed could be when the whole of our reality lied within. So what I mean by that is that we might have these awesome dreams of becoming individuals and escaping society and, speaking up for ourselves and all that shit. But at the end of the day, we're still going to like succumb to like being tired, or succumb to, not really being lazy, or being scared, or all these things that kind of prevent us from doing that. And not even the highest, greatest ideal or the most powerful feeling can really defend itself against that.
Right. Right. Well, I mean, and that's the danger and the allure of, again, most idealistic kind of thought, that it's almost like that. It's that year zero thinking, or that, you're a soul who can wing free of the body, and therein you'll have your liberations and your problem will be solved. And, it's that back to the contrast with history and religion is like, dude, seekers and, teachers and people for all of history attest otherwise. They've been trying for a long time to escape. There is no escape.
Yes.
You can try to change it up anew. You can get rid of your gods only to get new ones. There's only so much.
Yeah, well, it reminds me of this
I think
movie.
I think a lot of people just don't want to admit, like, oh, that there are serious limitations. It's
Yeah.
like because Western civilization has been so damn successful and productive, it's almost like a, what do you call it, victim of its own success, right?
Yes.
And some of those engines that carried us forward arguably hold us back, and
Yeah, exactly.
or maybe it just suited our minds and bodies for a particular space and time. And now that we're supposedly rational, gifted creatures, like maybe now it's catching up to us that we're not so great. Or maybe you could frame it like that. I'm not trying to be a dick or be cynical here, but it begs the question, right?
Well, our technology evolved faster than us.
Yeah, that's a kind analogy. That's giving us a lot of credit, right? Going
Yeah.
like in the face of just perpetual death for perpetual, right? Like that's the whole thing. It's like it never stops. When do we stop looking towards the future going, oh God, what's going to happen next?
Well,
It seems like a lot of people, it's almost like they want to put a cap on history. It's like they want to say, okay, no more, just stop already. No more production, no more consumption, no more suffering. Like, can't we just be? And it's like, it's
yeah.
not exactly how the mechanism works though. But
No,
it's like,
it's not.
you know what I'm talking about? Like you can kind of smell it in people when they kind of have it. That kind of
Yes.
sentiment. And it's like, well, you might think and feel that way, but like, there's no way these people are going to stop. Like, even if you were a Socrates, you're not going to get these people to stop.
Yeah. Well,
It's not in our nature to. We can't. Like, we got to survive. Like food doesn't just appear on your plate.
yeah, and people want to keep getting their food from the grocery store. And well, I mean, what I wanted to say was that there's this movie where this guy and his friend or whatever, they go to the Grand Canyon, and then they're looking at it for about 10 minutes. And then one of them looks at the other person and they say, all right, well, do we look at it long enough? It's like, it's cool. Like people kind of just lose their interest in a lot of movements that happen. Right. It sounds so great. And then they kind of lose their interest in it. pretty
Right.
fast.
Right. So if we're looking at the end of the essay itself, you read this earlier, happiness and contentment, equability of souls. But he ends it, kind of frames it in what he thinks was his approach and opinion. Jung
Yeah.
says, quote, "I hope therefore that that a psychiatrist who in the course of a long life has devoted himself to the causes and consequences of psychic disorders may be permitted to express his opinion and all the modesty enjoined upon him as an individual about the questions raised by the world situation today. I am neither spurned by the excessive optimism nor in love with high ideals, but am merely concerned with the fate of the individual human being, that infinitesimal unit on whom a world depends, and in whom, if we read the meaning of the Christian message aright, even God seeks his goal." So maybe God should have higher standards.
Yeah.
Jokes aside, in all seriousness, though, he's saying that the Western world ever managed to care and say that the individual does matter. It took like 2,000 years to recognize that in a more meaningful way, but
Yeah.
2,000 years, it's not that long, right? Like really,
Yeah.
in the grand scheme of things.
Well, I think that's probably a good place to.
Yeah, excuse me. Good place to stop. So we've been discussing Jung's Undiscovered Self. I'd recommend it to everyone. I appreciate you coming on here, Greg, to discuss this. It's pretty, just like our talks on self-reliance, like it's as relevant as ever. It's going to stay relevant. This is no
Always.
difference. Greg, please share with us where people can find you.
Yeah, my website is into-the-absurd.com. And you can find my podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Anchor, and YouTube. It's Into the Absurd. It's pretty simple. And then the logo, it's basically Sisyphus pushing a boulder up the hill, but the boulder is a yin yang symbol. And all my platforms are available at my website. And again, that's into-the-absurd.com.
Into-the-absurd.com.
Yep.
Excellent. Yeah, no, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it. This has been Every Trivial Fact. I'm your host. My name is Noah. Thanks for listening. Thanks for being here, Greg, and we'll catch you later.
Awesome.
This has been Every Trivial Fact. I've been your host. My name is Noah, and you can find my writing and other guest podcasts at my website, bezabezar.com. That's BEZABEZAR.com. And you can find the podcast itself on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Anchor. Be sure to check out what's posted on the podcast episode in YouTube below bars for relevant links and the guest information. And if you're so inclined, feel free to share the work if you think it's worthwhile. Leave a comment or review if you love it, or even if you hate it. And you're welcome back anytime, so feel free to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you on the horizon.